At the turn of the second millennium, the lands beyond the Carpathian Mountains became a meeting ground for very different worlds. On one side stood the settled communities of the Romanians, rooted in agriculture, village life, and continuity. On the other side moved the Turkic nomads of the steppe, shaped by mobility, warfare, and shifting alliances. Their interaction was not simple or one-dimensional. It was a complex relationship that unfolded over generations, shaped by trade, conflict, adaptation, and coexistence. Because written sources from this period are often unclear or incomplete, understanding this relationship requires looking deeper into how these societies functioned. Archaeology becomes especially important here, offering physical evidence that can refine timelines and even clarify contradictions found in written accounts. By placing these two ways of life side by side, we can better understand how they influenced each other and how their worlds overlapped in this frontier region of medieval Europe. By the time these encounters took place, the Romanian people had already formed a distinct identity. Their origins go back to a long process that unfolded on both sides of the lower Danube. Over time, the local population developed a language that separated from Latin and other Romance languages, shaped strongly by contact with Slavic-speaking groups. This influence gave Romanian its unique sound and structure, setting it apart from its Western relatives. During the early medieval period, this evolving language existed in a largely oral form, gradually stabilizing over centuries. At the same time, outside observers began to identify these people with names like Vlach, a term used broadly for Romance-speaking populations. These labels appeared first in regions closer to major centres of learning and power, such as Constantinople, simply because those areas were better documented. This does not mean that the population originated there, only that they were first recorded there. What is particularly striking is that these communities themselves were aware of their Roman roots. Various medieval writers noted that the people we now call Romanians understood their connection to the Roman past, both in language and identity. However, clear written evidence from regions north of the Danube appears later, making this awareness harder to trace in those areas. Over time, the name they use for themselves also began to surface in written sources. In one medieval Italian description of the world, two different names were listed for what was actually the same population, showing how little outsiders sometimes understood about the people they described. Misinterpretations like these were common, reflecting the limits of medieval knowledge rather than the reality on the ground. Meanwhile, linguistic diversity existed within the broader Romanian world. Different regional forms developed in the Balkans and surrounding regions, yet north of the Danube there was a remarkable level of unity in language. Despite political divisions and the formation of separate states over time, the core language remained consistent across a wide territory. This stability stands in contrast to the fragmentation seen in many other parts of medieval Europe and highlights the strong cultural continuity of the population. At the same time, the steppe world to the east and north was dominated by nomadic confederations, most of them of Turkic origin. Groups such as the Pechenegs, the Oghuz, and the Cumans moved across vast distances, forming alliances and absorbing smaller tribes along the way. These confederations were not uniform nations, but loose coalitions of different peoples brought together by circumstance, often forced into motion by pressure from other groups. Even so, their dominant cultural and linguistic character was Turkic. Earlier theories that tried to link them to completely different origins have long been abandoned, as modern research has clarified their background more accurately. Life on the steppe naturally produced diversity. These nomadic groups often included people who spoke different languages or came from different ethnic backgrounds. Some communities within these confederations may have spoken Iranian languages, while others had origins linked to different regions of Asia. Still, What unified them was a shared way of life built around mobility, horse culture, and adaptation to the open landscapes of the Eurasian steppe. Their languages, while related, also showed variation over time and space. Scholars of the medieval Islamic world observed that some Turkic languages remained closer to an original form, while others changed through contact with neighbouring peoples. This process of linguistic change was a natural result of the vast distance these groups travelled and the many cultures they encountered. To outsiders, however, these differences were often invisible. Byzantine and Middle Eastern writers frequently used broad labels, calling many of these groups simply Turks, regardless of their specific identity. In these texts, the word did not always refer to a single ethnic group, but rather to a general type of nomadic people from the steppe. This explains why even groups like the Hungarians or later the Mongols were sometimes described using the same term. It was less a precise label and more a way of categorizing unfamiliar peoples who shared a similar lifestyle. Names of leaders and tribes further confirm the Turkic character of these groups, as many of them appear across different regions and cultures with similar forms. There is also evidence of writing systems used by steppe populations, including runic scripts that spread across parts of Eurasia. However, these scripts were not exclusive to a single group and were shared among various peoples, making it difficult to attribute them with certainty. Cultural exchange was constant in this environment, and ideas, symbols, and technologies often moved freely between groups. In both Eastern and Western traditions, there was also a tendency to explain the origins of these nomadic peoples through shared ancestry. Medieval writers sometimes linked them to common legendary ancestors, reflecting an attempt to make sense of their connections. Even among the nomads themselves, stories of shared origins helped strengthen bonds between different tribes and confederations. When historians try to understand the relationship between the Romanian population and the Turkic nomads who entered the Carpathian Danube region between the 10th and 13th centuries, language becomes one of the clearest starting points. Many of the nomadic groups who moved across this frontier spoke Turkic languages, especially those belonging to the Oghuz and Chipchak branches. These were not isolated tongues, but part of a wider linguistic world stretching deep into the Eurasian steppe. Different nomadic confederations used related speech forms, yet each had its own particular features shaped by migration, contact, and political change. The early Oghuz tribes spoke one form, while the Pechenegs and later Oghuz groups used another, and the Cumans belonged to the older and very important Chipchak branch. This matters because it reminds us that the nomads arriving near the Carpathians were not an undefined mass. They came with their own linguistic identities, traditions, and internal distinctions, even if outside observers often grouped them all together under one broad label. Among all these languages, Cuman is the best known today, largely because it left behind one of the most valuable written records connected to the medieval steppe. That source is a remarkable collection preserved in Venice, containing vocabulary lists and religious writings in Latin, Persian, and Cuman. It gives us a rare chance to hear, across the centuries, the voice of a world that was otherwise mostly transmitted through outsiders. Part of this collection appears to have been compiled by a merchant deeply involved in the Black Sea trade routes, a man who needed language not for scholarship, but for daily contact, negotiation, and survival. Later sections were added by a religious writer from Central or Eastern Europe. The result is more than a dictionary. It is a window into commerce, mission work, cultural contact, and the effort to communicate across very different civilizations. The Cuman words preserved there also show that this language absorbed influences from many directions. Scholars have identified words borrowed from Greek, East Slavic, Mongolian, Arabic, Persian, and Hebrew, along with a strong layer of Christian religious vocabulary. What this shows is that the steppe was not cut off from the rest of the medieval world. It was connected to trade, diplomacy, conversion, and movement on a very wide scale. Other traces of the Cuman language survived much later in texts produced by Armenian communities in towns such as Kamianets and Lviv. These communities wrote in the Armenian alphabet, yet preserved fragments of Turkic speech, another sign of how mobile and interconnected the world of Eastern Europe had become. Language on the steppe was never frozen. It moved with people, mixed with other traditions, and adapted to new settings. The same can be said of the nomadic societies themselves. These were rarely ethnically uniform communities. Steppe confederations were often built by conquest, alliance, and incorporation. Defeated groups could be absorbed into the military and political structure of a stronger power. Alliances were constantly formed against common enemies, then dissolved when circumstances changed. In this world, Pechenegs joined forces with Uzes, Cumans with Brodniks, Cumans with Alans, and many other combinations appeared over time. These unions were often temporary, but they shaped the political map of the region again and again. The nomadic world was therefore highly flexible, capable of reorganizing itself quickly in response to new threats and opportunities. If language helps define who these nomads were, demography helps explain how they affected the lands into which they moved. Any serious attempt to understand relations between Romanians and Turkic nomads must ask a difficult question. How many people were involved on each side? Medieval written sources are of limited help here. They tend to give far more attention to nomads than to the local settled population. And this is not surprising. Chroniclers were drawn to war, invasions, and dramatic movement. They wrote about armies crossing rivers, raids, battles, and rulers in crisis. Quiet agricultural communities did not attract the same attention even when they formed the demographic majority. As a result, the Romanian element often appears faintly in the written record, while the nomads seem larger, louder, and more numerous than they may actually have been. This imbalance in the sources has distorted historical perception for a long time. Yet some clues survive. One important piece of evidence comes from a church document issued in the early 13th century, which reveals that in a region under Hungarian control, Catholic settlers had adopted the faith of the Romanians. That could hardly have happened unless the Romanian population there had been both numerous and socially organised. This was not the picture of a scattered and insignificant population. It suggests instead a stable local society with enough strength to influence others, even inside a politically contested zone. Similar religious shifts would happen again in later centuries, showing that confessional influence could move from below through everyday contact, not only from rulers and official institutions. This is a vital point because it suggests that beneath the dramatic stories of nomadic raids, there remained a deep and enduring local population structure. Some historians have suggested that in territories shared by farmers and nomads, the most workable ratio would be roughly 10 settled agriculturalists for every one nomad. The reason is simple. Farmland can support far denser populations than pasture land. Although exact numbers for the medieval Carpathian Dnester region cannot be proven with certainty, the archaeological evidence makes such a ratio plausible, especially for the period between the 10th and 12th centuries. In Moldavia, the local population appears to have been much larger in the earlier part of this period, then to have declined sharply during the 13th century, before beginning to recover again in the 14th. Archaeology is crucial here because settlement remains. Tell a story that written sources do not. Excavated villages, cemeteries, tools, and traces of long occupation show that the native population was not marginal. It was deeply rooted in the landscape. The settlement evidence from Moldavia and the lands east of the Carpathians points to a broad network of local communities spread across plains, hills, and uplands. These settlements belong to archaeological cultures, long used by scholars to classify the region's early medieval population. Even if the names given to those cultures are debated, their material remains reveal continuity in village life and farming traditions. In some parts of Bessarabia, more than half of the settlements from the 10th and 11th centuries show signs of earlier occupation as well, which suggests that many communities did not simply appear overnight, but had deeper roots. At the same time, the number of known sites falls significantly in the 12th and 13th centuries, especially in the southern steppe zones. This decline is one of the clearest archaeological signs of pressure from nomadic expansion. Villages were abandoned, populations withdrew from vulnerable lowlands, and some areas that had once supported dense rural life became far thinner in population. This change was especially visible in the broad plain between the Siret and the Dniester. Earlier centuries show a much larger concentration of settlements there, while later periods reveal a marked drop. Southern Moldavia seems to have held one of the largest local populations in the 10th and 11th centuries, only to suffer a dramatic decline afterward. The mountain regions, by contrast, always had fewer settlements, which is understandable given the limits they imposed on agriculture. What emerges from this pattern is not a story of total disappearance, but of displacement, retreat, and regional contraction under pressure. The native population remained, but its distribution changed. In the most exposed areas, especially those attractive to steppe pastoralists, local communities appear to have diminished or moved. Because written records for the early centuries are so poor, historians have tried to estimate population levels by working backward from later medieval and early modern evidence. Although these later numbers cannot be projected directly into earlier centuries, they help create a broad demographic framework. Moldavia in later centuries clearly supported hundreds of thousands of people, though growth rose and fell according to war, disease, and political stability. Rural cemeteries from the medieval period also remind us how fragile life was. Infant mortality was extremely high, and average life expectancy was low. This means population growth was always vulnerable. Even small disruptions could have major effects over time. When one combines these realities with the archaeological map of settlements, a rough estimate becomes possible. For the 9th to early 11th century, the local population east of the Carpathians may have reached around 250,000 people. Later, after the retreat of communities from exposed lowlands and the demographic shocks of the 12th and 13th centuries, that number may have dropped significantly, perhaps to around 100,000 or somewhat more during the period of greatest decline. Only after the early 14th century did population growth begin to recover again. As for the nomads, the written sources often present astonishingly high numbers, but these must be treated with extreme caution. Byzantine chroniclers in particular describe enormous masses of Pechenegs, Uzes, and Cumans crossing rivers and threatening the empire. Some accounts speak of hundreds of thousands of people, even close to 1 million. Such figures are almost certainly exaggerated. They reflect the fears, rhetoric, and political needs of the writers as much as any reality on the ground. Imperial authors had every reason to magnify the danger posed by their enemies, especially when trying to explain defeats or justify extraordinary responses. A nomadic migration would certainly have been dramatic and destructive, but the Balkan economy of the 11th century could hardly have supported the sudden arrival of such impossible numbers without complete collapse. More believable are the smaller figures given for later Cuman groups fleeing the Mongols, numbering in the tens of thousands rather than the hundreds of thousands. For that reason, it is safer to think of the nomadic population in more restrained terms. All the Pechenegs, Uzezes, and Cumans together may perhaps have numbered up to around 1 million across the wider steppe world, but only a portion of them would have been present in the outer Carpathian region at any one time. Large military gatherings were exceptional events, often linked to major migrations or campaigns. Day-to-day nomadic occupation involved far smaller groups, scattered across pasture lands. In the early 11th century, since native settlements still existed in the lowlands, many of the Pechenegs probably remained farther east and only later moved deeper into the Bugiak and neighbouring regions. Their shift westward seems to have been driven by the growing need for grazing land, and as they advanced, local farming communities were pushed back. The process was real, but its scale remains difficult to measure precisely. Later, comparisons with the Tatars of the same region offer a useful perspective. In the 16th to 18th centuries, the population of steppe groups in southeastern Moldavia was still significant, but far smaller than the great figures found in medieval chronicles. Estimates vary widely, but they usually point to tens of thousands, not hundreds of thousands. Even these later communities were no longer purely nomadic, since many had already begun to settle and combine pastoralism with agriculture. That would have allowed them to support larger populations than the earlier Turkic nomads of the 11th to 13th centuries. If so, then the earlier nomadic populations in the region were probably not larger than these later examples, and perhaps even smaller. All of this leads to an important conclusion. The native population east of the Carpathians was almost certainly more numerous than the Turkic nomads who entered the region, even though the nomads dominate the written narratives. The drama of raids, invasions, and military alliances made them highly visible to chroniclers. But visibility is not the same as demographic weight. The archaeological record tells a quieter but more revealing story. It shows a broad rural society rooted in settlement and cultivation, a society that suffered disruption and retreat under pressure from steppe migrations, yet did not vanish. The nomads were powerful, mobile, and politically significant, but they did not replace the native population. Instead, they entered a land already inhabited by dense local communities, altered its demographic balance in some regions, and forced major changes in settlement patterns. In the end, the history of the outer Carpathian region was shaped not by the complete triumph of one world over another, but by the difficult coexistence of two very different ways of life, one settled and enduring, the other mobile and forceful, each leaving its mark on the medieval landscape. When we look at the native villages east and south of the Carpathians between the 9th and 13th centuries, one of the first things that stands out is their size and placement. These were not tiny, hidden communities lost in remote wilderness. Many were large rural settlements spread across several hectares, usually built in practical and open locations. They appeared in river meadows, along gentle hillsides, in lowlands and close to sources of water. Some stood directly beside rivers or lakes, showing how strongly village life depended on access to communication routes, fertile land, and daily water supply. What we do not see very often are settlements placed high in the mountains, far from movement and exchange. The people who built these villages clearly chose places that allowed them to farm, graze animals, travel, and stay connected to the wider landscape. Their world was settled, practical, and deeply tied to the rhythms of the land. Another striking feature is that most of these villages were open settlements. Fortified sites existed only rarely. Unlike neighbouring regions where earthworks, ditches, palisades, and hilltop defences became common, the Romanian lands east and south of the Carpathians show a notable absence of such strongholds during this period. This is important because it cannot be explained by technological backwardness or by some inability to build defensive works. Nearby peoples did build them. Communities in Transylvania raised earth and timber defences. In the northern Balkans, Vlach groups are described as having stone fortresses. Slavic tribes in the middle Dniester and Upper Prut regions also maintained fortified settlements, just like many other peoples in Central and Eastern Europe. So the question is not whether the local population could have built fortifications. The better question is why they generally did not. A convincing explanation may lie in the relationship between the settled population and the nomadic powers that dominated or pressured the region. Fortresses are symbols of resistance. Any power seeking to keep a conquered population under control would naturally try to prevent the construction of new strongholds and destroy old ones. This pattern appears again and again in medieval history. Mongol rulers forced subject peoples to demolish fortifications and forbade the rebuilding of defensive walls. Similar policies appeared later under Ottoman rule, when local princes were ordered to tear down fortresses and prevented from constructing new ones. In this light, the scarcity of strongholds in the outer Carpathian region may reflect deliberate suppression. If local communities were kept from fortifying themselves, that would have made rebellion much more difficult. The destruction of earlier fortified places in the region likely served as a warning to anyone tempted to challenge nomadic authority. In other words, the open character of these villages may not reflect peace or weakness, but a political reality in which the local population was not allowed to develop fortified centres. These settlements were rural in every sense. Before the great Mongol invasion, no true towns emerged in Moldavia. Urbanization east of the Carpathians came late, and that delay likely reflects the collapse of earlier urban traditions in the wider Lower Danube world. The towns of antiquity had disappeared centuries earlier, and with them much of the older urban framework. The Romanian language itself preserves almost no clear trace of the Latin vocabulary of city life from this region, which suggests just how deeply that earlier urban world had vanished. What remained instead was a landscape dominated by villages, pastures, forests, river routes, and local agricultural life. In the hilly and forested parts of Moldavia and the sub-Carpathian zone, villages were often isolated from one another. That pattern survived for centuries, and in some places can still be recognized today. River valleys acted as the main routes of communication, while roads followed natural openings through the terrain. New land for houses, fields, and grazing was created by clearing forests. Those same forests also provided protection in times of danger. A village under threat could withdraw into wooded shelter, a practical survival strategy in a frontier zone exposed to instability and raids. In the Eastern Carpathians, even today, permanent settlements can be found at considerable altitude, while seasonal settlements connected with pastoral movement rise even higher. Although direct archaeological evidence is still limited, it is very likely that medieval Romanian communities also used temporary highland settlements, especially in relation to seasonal herding. This would fit well with the long pastoral traditions of the population. Because no single settlement from this period has been completely excavated, our view of village structure remains incomplete. Even so, the evidence from carefully investigated sites allows some broader conclusions. In the 9th to 11th centuries, villages in the hilly regions of central and southern Moldavia often had houses clustered fairly close together, their placement shaped by the form and stability of the ground. Ethnographic comparisons suggest that villages with tightly grouped houses tend to belong to communities practicing mixed farming, where crop cultivation and stock breeding are combined. Villages with more widely dispersed houses are more often linked to communities focused more heavily on herding. The structure of a settlement was therefore not random. It reflected both the environment and the economic life of the people who lived there. In mountain zones, settlements often stretched along valleys in irregular, branching patterns following the shape of the land itself. Modern scholars of Romanian rural geography later divided villages into several broad types: grouped, dispersed, and scattered. That classification was created for more recent periods, but it likely applies quite well to the medieval world too, because the basic economic forces shaping village form changed only slowly over time. In central Moldavia, the most common village types seem to have been grouped and dispersed settlements. Some villages even combined both forms, with one part more compact and another more spread out. In later centuries, dispersed villages became especially common in some regions, but in the plains and low hills, compact villages also appeared, especially where fertile dark soils and steppe vegetation supported successful agriculture. It is worth noting that some of these lowland regions had earlier been emptied or weakened by nomadic expansion, and only after that pressure receded were they more fully repopulated by settled farming communities. This means that the map of village life changed over time, shaped not only by geography but also by waves of migration and political control. Against this settled rural world stood the Turkic nomads of the steppe. Their society was built around horseback mobility, large herds, and the constant search for pasture. Contemporary writers consistently describe groups such as the Pechenegs, Uzes, and Cumans as nomads, and Byzantine authors often called them Scythians, not because they were literally the same people as the ancient Scythians, but because they resembled the classic image of mounted steppe peoples. Other medieval sources emphasize the same way of life. These were communities that moved with their animals, sought regions rich in water and grass, and did not depend on permanent towns or agricultural villages in the same way as settled populations. Pastoralism shaped everything in nomadic life. Herds were not just a source of food, they were wealth, transport, status, and survival. A major loss of animals could be disastrous. Hunting, gathering, or occasional farming might help for a short time, but none of these could replace the central importance of livestock. Because of this, Turkic movements were not simply military actions carried out by isolated groups of warriors. Entire families often moved together with the flocks. Even military expeditions were supported by herds of horses, used for riding, for pulling carts, and sometimes for food. This kind of mobile life had deep roots in the history of Eurasia. From antiquity to the early modern age, descriptions of steppe peoples remain surprisingly similar. Ancient Greek and Roman authors, Byzantine chroniclers, Arab geographers, Persian writers, Russ's chroniclers, and later travellers all describe pastoral nomads in much the same terms. Communities without fixed cities, moving through open lands with their animals, ready for war, but also organised around seasonal needs. The ancient Chinese description of the steppe peoples of Inner Asia captures this world vividly. It portrays people whose wealth lay in horses, cattle, and sheep, who moved in search of water and pasture, who had no stable cities and practiced little or no agriculture, and whose children learned to ride and shoot from an early age. Such a description could easily apply to many later Turkic nomads of Eastern Europe. They were warriors, but their warfare grew out of a larger mobile economy. In peace, they wandered with their herds. In danger, they turned quickly to war. Their fighting style, their social hierarchy, even their diet and clothing all reflected this pastoral way of life. This mobility was not random wandering. It followed clear seasonal patterns. No nomadic group could stay too long in one place, because pasture would be exhausted and needed time to recover. So families and herds moved regularly from one grazing zone to another. In summer, when the plains dried out and fresh grass became scarce, animals were driven northward toward river valleys and forest steppe areas, where moisture lasted longer. In winter, the nomads returned south, often toward lakes, coastal zones, and regions influenced by the Black Sea climate, where snow melted more quickly and dry grass remained accessible. These seasonal migrations were one of the defining features of steppe life. They are described for the Pechenegs, the Oghuz, the Cumans, the Khazars, the Bulgars, and later the Mongols as well. Even large political states that emerged from nomadic traditions often preserved this pattern, with rulers and ordinary herders alike moving between summer and winter camps. The routes of these migrations could vary greatly depending on environment. Some steppe groups moved only a few dozen kilometers between seasonal pastures, while others travelled hundreds or even more than 1,000 kilometers. In the East Carpathian region, where winter camps may have been placed near the Danube and coastal lakes, seasonal routes probably stretched several hundred kilometers. Such movement required planning. The old idea that Romanian transhumance followed fixed routes, while steppe nomadism was chaotic, does not hold up. Nomadic movement was highly organized. Pasture lands had to be used in a carefully timed sequence, or herds would starve. Burial sites from different periods often reappear in the same zones, suggesting that traditional migration corridors and seasonal territories remained in use for very long periods. After the Mongols took control of the steppe, they established clear boundaries for each clan's grazing lands. But such organization almost certainly existed long before. At the same time, these systems were vulnerable to conflict. Competition for pastures created constant tension. Tribes fought over grazing rights, and some groups entered the service of neighbouring states after losing access to lands they once controlled. This reveals a deep contradiction at the heart of nomadic life. On one hand, steppe society required order, rules, and boundaries to distribute pasture properly. On the other hand, it constantly pushed outward in search of more land, more herds, and greater advantage. That tension helped fuel both internal conflict and external expansion. And although these Turkic communities remained fundamentally nomadic, signs of partial settlement also began to appear. Seasonal winter camps may have served as the starting point for more permanent habitation. Elderly people, poorer families, or those less able to move may have stayed behind when the main body of the group returned north. Over time, such places could grow into semi-settled communities. Yet their development was often interrupted by new migrations or new waves of conflict. Written sources sometimes mention Cuman strongholds and towns, especially in the lands farther east, though it is not always clear whether these were true urban centres or simply defended winter camps. Some were likely named after Cuman leaders. Others may have been modest settlements rather than real cities. In any case, in the East Carpathian region itself, there is no clear evidence for towns or fortifications built by the Turkic nomads. The local picture remains one of open native villages and highly mobile pastoral groups, not of an urbanized frontier. The houses of the settled population reflect this contrast very clearly. Native settlements included both above-ground structures and buildings with sunken floors. Some above-ground houses stood at ground level, while others were dug slightly into the earth. Their walls were often made of wattle, coated with clay, and because these materials decay easily, archaeologists often struggle to reconstruct their outlines. Even so, the evidence suggests modest, rectangular buildings equipped with hearths made of stone or clay. Slightly sunken houses were especially common and remained part of local building traditions for many centuries. They were usually single-room structures, rectangular in plan, with walls supported by posts and roofs likely covered with thatch or wooden shingles. In some cases, benches were fixed along the walls. Inside, heating and cooking were provided by stone hearths, stone ovens, or carefully shaped clay ovens. These ovens were often placed in the corner opposite the entrance, showing a repeated domestic pattern. Fully sunken buildings also existed, though they seem to have been less common. These had floors dug deeper below ground level, which helped keep them warm in winter and cool in summer. Most were still single-room houses, though one remarkable example had 2 rooms and a far deeper floor. These buildings usually lacked open hearths, and instead used ovens built into the wall or placed in a corner. What is important is that this style of architecture has very deep roots. Sunken or partly sunken houses had existed since prehistoric times, and in some regions survived into modern centuries. Travellers in the 18th century still described poor rural dwellings dug into the ground, with roofs only slightly rising above the surface and smoke escaping through small chimneys. This long continuity highlights the durability of local architectural traditions. Around the houses, archaeologists have found many other features of daily life: outdoor ovens, storage pits, refuse pits, and grain silos. These silos were often carefully treated to protect stored food from moisture and rodents. Some houses also contained clay trays or fixtures linked to ovens, perhaps used in baking bread or cereals. Such finds point to stable household routines centered on cooking, storage, and agricultural production. Clusters of 2 or 3 nearby buildings have also been discovered in some settlements. These do not necessarily represent separate, unrelated families. They may instead reflect compounds used by different generations of the same kin group, or a sequence in which one building replaced another over time. Ethnographic parallels suggest that houses could be built close together for practical reasons, and abandoned structures might later be turned into storage spaces or barns. In the great grasslands of Eurasia, the way people lived shaped everything around them, including the buildings they used. For the mounted nomads of the steppe, architecture was never meant to be permanent, in the same way as the houses of farming communities. Their lives depended on movement, on herds, and on the constant search for water and pasture. Because of this, their homes had to move with them. Contemporary writers who knew these peoples well repeatedly stressed that they did not live in stable villages or fixed houses. Instead, they relied on carts, wagons, tents, and felt-covered huts. The Pechenegs, for example, are often described as living in tents and using wagons not only for transport but also as part of their everyday shelter. Similar descriptions appear for the Oghuz, who are said to have lived in felt dwellings and travelled across frozen rivers with their carts. Medieval observers describing the wider Turkic world in Central Asia make the same point again and again. These were people without permanent fortified settlements, people whose homes were made to be dismantled, loaded, and moved whenever the needs of the herd demanded it. The same image appears in descriptions of the Cumans. Western chroniclers saw them as a people without ploughed fields, cabins, or permanent houses, living instead in felt tents and feeding on milk, cheese, and meat. Other writers describing the steppe under Mongol rule say much the same. These populations spent one season in one place and another season somewhere else, never building a settled urban life in the way that agricultural peoples did. Even later, visual sources show them still using carts and simple portable winter structures, while many written accounts confirm that tents remained central to their daily existence. This was not an improvised or primitive lifestyle. It was a highly functional system, perfectly adapted to the demands of nomadic pastoralism. Even the rulers of these steppe worlds lived in this mobile tradition. Turkic and Mongol Khans stayed in great tents or yurts made of felt and cloth, large enough to hold many people and to serve as political centres on the move. Travellers who saw similar dwellings in later centuries described them as round structures, with trellis walls, poles rising toward a central opening, and coverings of thick felt or coarse cloth stretched over the frame. The door was low and narrow, forcing anyone entering to bend down, while an opening at the top allowed smoke to escape and light to enter. Inside, a fireplace stood in the middle, and the whole structure could be assembled, dismantled, or even transported on wagons. The size and quality of such a yurt reflected the wealth and rank of its owner. Simple people had modest dwellings, while powerful leaders could command enormous mobile residences that functioned almost like palaces of felt. These mobile homes were part of a long steppe tradition that stretched back to antiquity. The Scythians, Sarmatians, Huns, and Avars had all relied on similar patterns of movement, portable shelter, and wagon transport. Later, Turkic and Mongol populations simply continued and refined this older way of life. In many cases, wagons themselves became a vital part of the camp. They carried families, goods, felt coverings, and all the movable wealth of the nomadic household. In some cases, people even lived directly in wagons, or used them as the core around which camps were formed. This way of life continued for centuries. Travellers in the early modern period still describe Tatar groups in the Bujiak, living in carts and wagons rather than in permanent houses. When these wagons were drawn together and tied in a circle, they formed a temporary enclosure that functioned like a protective camp. This is where the steppe wagon took on a military role as important as its domestic one. Among nomadic peoples, wagons were not just for movement and shelter. They could also become walls. During campaigns or moments of danger, the wagons were arranged in a ring and fastened tightly together, creating a defensive barrier for warriors, families, herds, and supplies. This tactic had been used for centuries. Attila is said to have saved his army by retreating behind such a wagon circle. Khazars used similar methods against Arab forces. Pechenegs used them against Byzantines. Mongols employed the same strategy with great effect. In battle, these wagon lines could serve as mobile fortresses, protecting the camp and giving the nomads time to reorganize or defend themselves. The power of this tactic was so obvious that even non-nomadic peoples later adopted it. Byzantines, Slavic groups, Cossacks, Poles, and Hussite rebels all used wagon fortifications in one form or another. What began as a natural part of nomadic camp life became a recognized military technique across much of Eastern and Central Europe. Against this mobile world stood the settled Romanian communities of the Carpathian Danube region, whose economy rested on a very different balance. Their daily life was built around a mixed rural economy in which agriculture and animal husbandry supported one another. These were not two separate spheres in conflict, but two connected parts of the same household system. Fields needed draft animals, and animals depended on the products of cultivation as well as on pasture. In this kind of village economy, farming and stock breeding worked together in a stable and practical way. The local population aimed, above all, at subsistence. Each family tried to produce what it needed with minimal dependence on outside exchange. Crops, animals, tools, and household production all formed part of one self-sufficient world. In such a system, agriculture was not a secondary occupation borrowed late from neighbours. It was one of the oldest and deepest foundations of life in the region. Archaeology confirms this very clearly. Settlements were often located in fertile areas, exactly where one would expect farming communities to live. Excavations have uncovered agricultural tools, grinding stones, storage pits, and large quantities of charred grain. The number and variety of farming tools increases noticeably after the end of the first millennium, suggesting not decline, but growing agricultural intensity. Coulters, sickles, hoes, knives for cutting vegetation, and scraping tools all appear in significant numbers. In some places, even hordes of agricultural tools have been found, a strong sign that cultivation had become central enough for such equipment to be gathered and stored as valuable property. This larger number of tools also points to increased food demand and therefore to major demographic growth. The crops grown by these communities included several kinds of wheat and barley, along with rye, oats, millet, and peas. Many of these were cultivated in the region since prehistoric times, which shows a very long continuity of agricultural practice. Language supports the same conclusion. A remarkable number of Romanian words connected with ploughing, sowing, harvesting, grain, vegetables, and farming tools come directly from Latin. This linguistic survival shows that agriculture was deeply rooted in the society long before the rise of the medieval principalities. There are also many Slavic terms connected with agriculture in Romanian. But the adoption of that vocabulary does not mean that farming was learned from Slavs. On the contrary, such borrowing makes sense only if Romanian-speaking communities were already practicing developed agriculture and were capable of integrating additional technical language into an existing rural system. Ritual life also reveals the importance of cultivation. Across Romanian rural traditions, some of the strongest and oldest customs are tied to agriculture. Many of them revolve around fertility, rain, protection against hail, the safety of cattle, and the renewal of crops. These customs are especially revealing because they centre on older grains, such as wheat, rather than later imports like maize. That suggests a very old continuity in both farming practice and agricultural belief. All of this makes it difficult to accept older claims that medieval Romanians were mainly shepherds who only later adopted farming. Such ideas may reflect the situation of some Vlach groups in the Balkans, where transhuman pastoralism played a much larger role. But they do not fit the evidence from the lands north of the lower Danube. There, the environment and social conditions were different, and the economic balance was clearly more mixed. Still, this balance was not identical across all regions. Near the mountains, in areas with harsher weather and poorer soils, crop cultivation was less profitable, and communities relied more heavily on sheep and goats. In the fertile lowlands, by contrast, agriculture was much more important. This regional variation was entirely natural. Medieval peasant life was always shaped by land quality, climate, and access to pasture. Even so, the overall pattern remained one of combination rather than specialization. The typical household did not choose between farming and herding. It relied on both. The Turkic nomads, on the other hand, had a very different relationship to agriculture. Their economy was centered on livestock, and most medieval authors describe them as people who did not till the soil. Writers speaking of Pechenegs and Cumans near Hungary emphasize that they lived without agriculture. Other chroniclers say the same in different words, portraying them as peoples of milk, meat, and movement rather than of fields and villages. Yet the picture is not entirely absolute. Some sources mention millet among the foods of steppe peoples, and there is evidence from Central Asia that certain Turkic groups did cultivate limited crops. Archaeology has also shown that earlier nomadic empires such as the Huns, Avars, and Bulgars practiced at least some agriculture. The same was likely true, to a limited degree, for later Turkic groups. Even so, agriculture was clearly secondary in the nomadic economy. Their constant movement made regular cultivation difficult. A field cannot travel with the herd. Crops require time, protection, and seasonal attention, all of which conflict with a life built around mobility. If nomadic peoples did sow millet or other grains, it was probably on a modest scale, often in semi-settled winter camps, or under conditions of necessity. Ethnographic parallels suggest that pastoralists usually turned to agriculture only when poverty, political pressure, or loss of herds forced them to do so. This becomes especially important in the period after the Mongol conquest, when some Cuman groups likely lost part of their herds and may have been pushed toward more settled labour. But for the period between the 10th and 13th centuries, agriculture remained secondary among the Pechenegs, Uzes, and Cumans. Their world was still overwhelmingly pastoral. For the settled Romanian communities, animal husbandry was the second great pillar of economic life. Like agriculture, it also had deep local roots. Even the vocabulary of herding preserves many ancient words, including terms for shepherds, corrals, cheese, dung, goats, colts, and sheepfolds. The spread of some Romanian pastoral terms into neighbouring Slavic languages shows how strong and influential these traditions became over time. Archaeological evidence confirms the diversity of local herds. Animal bones from settlements reveal the breeding of cattle, sheep, goats, pigs, and horses, though the exact proportions varied from place to place. Some animals were used mainly for traction and transport, others for meat or dairy. The fact that domestic animal remains are found regularly in village contexts reinforces the idea of a mixed and sedentary economy, one in which pastoralism worked together with agriculture rather than replacing it. In regions near the mountains, some seasonal movement of herds certainly did occur. Sheep could be driven to higher summer pastures by hired shepherds, who stayed for a season in temporary sheepfolds, making dairy products and shearing the flocks before returning in autumn. This was a form of transhumance, but it was not nomadism. The shepherds moved, not the whole community. Their families remained at home, and the village remained the true social and economic centre. In winter, the animals were brought back near the settlements. This kind of seasonal pastoralism had its own rhythms and traditions, including the organised storage of hay in advance of winter. In the mountain world, gathering hay was a major communal task, essential for survival. This annual labour had such importance that it became almost a migration of its own, with entire communities temporarily relocating to mow, gather, and store fodder. Farther north and east, another older and more extensive pattern also existed in forested hills, river marshes, and places such as the Danube Delta, where cattle, pigs, and horses could roam more freely for long periods. This was a rough and archaic system, and not always efficient, since animals could fall prey to predators or become difficult to recover. Yet it shows once again how flexible local animal husbandry could be. The Romanian countryside supported many forms of herding, from controlled village stock breeding to seasonal movement and open grazing, all depending on region and environmental conditions. The arrival of the Turkic nomads into the Bugiac and the Romanian plain must have disrupted some of these older pastoral routes. In later centuries, shepherds from Transylvania still brought their flocks down to winter in the lowlands near the Danube, the coastal lakes, the delta, and even beyond the Dniester. But when those same zones became wintering grounds for steppe nomads, such movements became more dangerous. Romanian shepherds and Turkic herders were now competing for the same winter pastures, and the shepherds risked exposure to raids and conflict. This was one of the most direct ways in which the nomadic presence could interfere with local economic rhythms. Beyond farming and herding, the local population also drew resources from the forests and rivers. Hunting and fishing complemented the diet, though they do not seem to have been the main basis of subsistence. Wild animals such as stag, roe deer, wild boar, elk, hare, fox, and aurochs appear in faunal remains, showing that hunting was practiced both for meat and for protection against predators. Some arrowheads found on sites may have been used specifically for hunting rather than war. Fishing is harder to trace archaeologically, since tools survive less well. But fish bones and scales found on certain sites prove that it also formed part of local life. especially near rivers, lakes, and the Danube. Even so, fish and game were supplementary. The main weight of the local diet rested on crops, meat, and dairy products produced within the village economy. Before and after the Mongol invasion, the Turkic communities of the southern lands of Eastern Europe remained above all pastoral peoples. Their world was built around herds, movement, and open grazing. Because crop cultivation played only a limited role in their lives, their food came mainly from meat, milk, and dairy products. Their animals gave them far more than food. Herds also provided hides for clothing, leather for saddles and equipment, and valuable goods for exchange. To sustain this kind of life, they needed very large numbers of animals, and once herds reached such scale, simple local grazing was no longer enough. That is one of the key reasons why nomadic movement became essential. The steppe did not just allow this way of life, it demanded it. Medieval writers repeatedly speak of the extraordinary wealth of these nomadic peoples in livestock. The Pechenegs are described as owning large numbers of cattle and sheep, and in some accounts horses as well. They were known not only for breeding these animals, but also for trading them. The same is true for the Oghuz, who possessed horses, cattle, and sheep in abundance. When the Seljuks emerged from the wider Oghuz world, they too are described as moving with great numbers of horses, camels, oxen, and sheep. Some accounts go even further, claiming that wealthy Oghuz leaders could own many thousands of horses and enormous flocks of sheep. Whether those exact figures are exaggerated or not, the message is clear. Wealth in the steppe was counted in animals, and power rested on the ability to maintain and move them across vast grazing lands. Descriptions of the wider Turkic world reinforce this image. Some sources describe the western steppe peoples as people who lived in felt dwellings and wandered with their herds across meadows, water sources, and seasonal pasture lands, living on milk in summer and preserved meat in winter. Other writers add that such peoples had no villages or real houses, only grazing grounds, water, and animals. In some regions, camels were common, while in others, climate made them less useful. But sheep, horses, and cattle appear again and again as the true foundation of steppe life. Salt itself could become a luxury to be obtained through trade, which shows how strongly their existence was organized around livestock, rather than agriculture or settled production. The Cumans fit this same pattern. Whenever Rus's armies attacked their camps or settlements, the booty almost always included horses, sheep, oxen, and camels. This detail appears so often that it becomes impossible to ignore. Raiding the Cumans meant seizing herds, because herds were their wealth, their transport, and their survival. Even when Cuman leaders came to seek help from neighbouring rulers, their gifts reflected this pastoral economy. They offered horses, camels, buffaloes, and human captives. Later, when Cuman groups fled westward under the pressure of the Mongols, they did not move alone. They moved with their animals, because without those herds they would have lost the material basis of their society. After the rise of the Golden Horde, foreign travellers continued to be struck by the abundance of animals in the steppe. Some observed that the Mongols seemed to possess more horses than all other peoples combined. They also had many camels, sheep, goats, and oxen. One detail appears with special force in several accounts: the absence or rarity of pigs. That should not surprise us. Pigs do not fit easily into a nomadic lifestyle. They are not suited to long-distance movement across open grasslands in the same way as horses, sheep, cattle, or camels. This detail highlights how deeply the economy of the steppe was adapted to mobility. The animal world of the nomads was not random. It was shaped by climate, terrain, and the demands of constant movement. Writers describing the lands of the Golden Horde often stress that the population lived mainly from herds and that meat was abundant and cheap. Horseflesh appears frequently in such accounts, and dairy was equally central. Millet and other grains did enter the diet, but they did not define it. In this world, a ruler's pleasure was not found in fields, walls, or permanent palaces, but in leading people and livestock to the best pastures, finding the right place for the camp, and gathering everyone together in a great feast. That statement captures the mentality of pastoral power. The idea was not rootedness, but movement with abundance. The animals themselves were adapted to the harsh climate of the Eurasian steppe. Travellers often noted that steppe horses could scrape away snow with their hooves to reach the grass beneath. Sheep could survive under similarly difficult conditions. Camels and cattle in later Tatar communities of the Bujiak were also known for enduring severe winters. This resilience was essential in a region where fodder reserves were limited, and winter could be long and bitter. Animals had to survive with relatively little assistance, and steppe breeds were shaped by centuries of selection under those very conditions. The pastoral economy also produced a rich dairy culture. Among the most famous products was fermented mare's milk, the drink known across the steppe world and still associated with Central Asia today. This was not simply an everyday beverage for common herders. It also appeared in ceremonies and diplomacy, offered in important gatherings and political rituals. Such details remind us that milk and dairy were not marginal foods. They stood at the centre of both daily existence and elite culture in the pastoral world. Hunting also contributed to nomadic diet, especially in regions not yet fully transformed by agriculture. In the great open lands of Deshti Kipchak, venison and other game helped supplement food supplies. Since these peoples were skilled archers, hunting posed little difficulty. Fishing, on the other hand, seems to have played a smaller role among Turkic and Mongol populations than it did among sedentary peoples. Some observers even claim that steppe nomads barely knew how to fish. Whether that is entirely true or somewhat exaggerated, it reflects an important reality. Fishing was not central to the nomadic economy in the way that herding was. While the nomads relied on livestock, the settled Romanian communities of the region built a more balanced rural economy. Their households rested not on a single occupation, but on a combination of farming, herding, and small-scale craft production. Agriculture and animal husbandry worked together, and so did the domestic industries that supported them. In these local communities, most production was aimed first at household use. Food, clothing, tools, and everyday objects were often made within the family itself. Men and women had different tasks, and over time some people became more specialized, producing not just for their own needs, but also for exchange within the village or neighboring settlements. One of the most important of these crafts was ironworking. This was vital because a rural economy needed tools for cultivation, woodcutting, transport, and defence. Yet the region east of the Carpathians was not rich in easily available iron ore, so metalworking required effort and local knowledge to locate and exploit scattered deposits. Even so, the need for iron was too great to ignore. Population growth increased demand for food, and better agriculture required better tools. Archaeological excavations show iron blooms, slag, and finished implements on many settlement sites, proving that iron smelting and smithing had become significant parts of village life. The tools and weapons recovered from these settlements show not only consumption, but also local production. Pottery was another major craft, and by the 9th century, significant changes were underway. Older handmade pottery or vessels shaped on slower wheels gradually gave way to better wheel-made ceramics. This shift marks an important technical advance. Clay was prepared more carefully, firing improved, and vessel forms became more standardized. The range of pottery remained practical rather than luxurious, with pots and bowls dominating. But the very improvement in quality tells us that village production was becoming more skilled and more efficient. In later phases, clay kettles also became common in some areas. Some fine grey or yellow ceramics may have been locally made, while others probably came from south of the Danube. This combination of local production and outside influence shows that even rural pottery traditions were not static. Other household crafts also left traces. Grinding stones reveal the production of flour at home. Spindle whorls show the making of thread and textiles. There is less direct evidence for other forms of work such as cart making. But given the needs of daily life, such activities must have been essential. What matters most is that the archaeology suggests crafts were no longer just incidental tasks within the household. They were beginning to develop into more distinct and recognized forms of labor inside rural society. When we turn back to the Nomads, written sources are much less precise about specialized crafts, but enough survives to sketch a broad picture. Much of what we know from later Mongol times likely also reflects older Turkic realities. Household labor was strongly divided by gender. Men built carts and dwellings, made bows, arrows, harnesses and saddles, prepared fermented milk and tanned hides. Women cooked, sewed clothing, made footwear, and prepared bedding and textiles. This was a world in which domestic production remained central, but it was not crude or undeveloped. The Pechenegs and Oghuz are described as having many weapons, metal vessels, belts, standards, and battle horns. Such objects did not appear by magic. They had to be made, repaired, and maintained by skilled craftsmen, including smiths, working within nomadic communities. Archaeology confirms the high level of technical ability among these steppe peoples. Burial finds attributed to Turkic nomads have yielded sabres, spearheads, arrowheads, daggers, knives, axes, stirrups, buckles, scissors, mirrors, rings, pendants, cauldrons, bows reinforced with bone or antler, and many other objects made of metal, bone, wood, and horn. The relative uniformity of these objects suggests that many were produced within nomadic society itself. Horse gear, and weapons in particular, show consistency and skill. Their quality is often fully comparable to similar finds from farther east across the steppe. This raises a difficult question. Where did the metal come from in lands without rich local iron deposits? We do not have a full answer, but it is clear that steppe craftsmen were not simply passive users of imported objects. They were active makers. One detail is especially revealing. Unlike settled populations, Turkic nomads do not seem to have used the potter's wheel in any meaningful way. Most pottery associated with them is handmade, except for imported wares. This fits the logic of mobile life. Fine wheel-made pottery belongs more naturally to stable workshops and fixed settlements than to camps that move with the seasons. Even when ceramic forms in the wider region may have eastern roots, that does not mean the nomads themselves produced them. Their domestic crafts were mostly practical, local, and household-based, designed to provide what their own communities needed. Trade, however, connected both worlds. Even though Romanian rural communities were largely self-sufficient, they were never completely isolated. No subsistence society lives entirely cut off from others unless geography imposes extraordinary barriers. The villages of southern and central Moldavia were tied together by shared building methods, pottery styles, tools, and ornaments, and such similarities point to ongoing communication. Those contacts extended beyond local networks into neighbouring Romanian and non-Romanian regions. Though direct evidence is limited for the earliest periods, later medieval patterns strongly suggest that these communities exchanged cattle, horses, sheep, cheese, fish, honey, wax, hides, furs, cereals, and especially salt. Animals were particularly convenient for trade because they could move on their own and did not require complex transport. Commercial relations linked the East Carpathian region to the northern Balkans and the East Slavic world. As Byzantine influence returned to the lower Danube and city, life revived in the region. Exchange intensified. Imported ceramic and metal objects found in the archaeological record prove that goods moved through these networks. Some Christian items came from Byzantium, others from Rus, showing that the region stood at the meeting point of several cultural and economic spheres. Coins provide an especially useful measure of these contacts. Islamic silver coins found in the region show that the Carpathian Dynasty lands were touched by vast exchange systems connecting Scandinavia, the Baltic, the Steppe, and the Muslim markets to the south and east. These coins were not local curiosities. They were part of long-distance trade routes operated by Vikings, Khazars, Volga Bulgars, Slavs, and many others. Several Islamic coins have been found on settlement sites, and some hoards contain numerous examples struck by different rulers across the Islamic world. Their presence reveals how far-reaching those commercial webs had become. Later, Byzantine coinage also played an important role. After a period of decline caused by earlier disruptions in the Balkans, Byzantine coin circulation revived from the late 10th century onward, especially when imperial power pushed northward again. In southern Moldavia, many bronze Byzantine coins have been found, suggesting real monetary use rather than mere hoarding for their metal value. These coins indicate that the region became more monetized during the early 11th century. Later, Byzantine coin finds become rarer, especially after the great political upheavals caused by revolts, the rise of new Balkan powers, and the capture of Constantinople by the Crusaders. From that point onward, gold Byzantine coins began to appear more sporadically, often linked to higher-level trade through Black Sea routes and merchant activity. For the Turkic nomads, long-distance trade was different. They did not create stable, overland commercial networks in the same way as the Khazars before them, because their political world was less centralized, and the steppe itself was marked by warfare, migration, and insecurity. These conditions made crossing the steppes more dangerous. Yet trade did not disappear. The great rivers of Eastern Europe continued to function as commercial arteries. The Volga, Don, Dnieper, and Danube still carried goods through the lands controlled by nomadic tribes. The nomads themselves did not become river traders in the strict sense, but they had every interest in protecting and taxing traffic that passed through their territory. The Pechenegs traded livestock, furs, wax, and other products to the Rus and to Byzantine centres, such as Cherson. In return, they received fine textiles, spices, luxury goods, and Eastern furs. They also traded in captives. This grim commerce in prisoners was not unique to them. Earlier, Hungarians and Khazars had done much the same, raiding neighbouring peoples and selling captives into larger markets. Under later Tatar rule, this traffic remained important. The same logic appears among the Cumans, who exchanged slaves, furs, and other goods in places such as Sudak. The Oghuz of Central Asia traded wool and other products with merchants from neighbouring settled lands, and their camps were visited by traders seeking exactly the kinds of goods that pastoral economies could provide. What the nomads wanted in return is just as revealing as what they sold. They sought fine cloth, imported objects, precious ornaments, and other luxury goods. This shows that steppe society was not socially flat. A tribal elite existed, and that elite used exotic goods to display wealth and status. Rich burial assemblages found in steppe graves confirm this. Some contain imported helmets, precious vessels, decorated belts, and ornaments of clear foreign origin. Such items could have been acquired through trade, tribute, or plunder, but all of them point to the same fact. The steppe elites were deeply connected to a wider world of prestige goods. Even so, barter probably remained more important than coin in pre-Mongol Turkic society. Coins appear more frequently in later burial contexts, especially from the late 13th and early 14th centuries, which suggests a growing but still limited monetization under Mongol rule. Even then, monetary use seems to have remained concentrated among the elite rather than spreading evenly through all levels of society. Most of the coins found in such graves are silver rather than bronze, again pointing to restricted and selective use rather than everyday market exchange. At the heart of local society in the Carpathian Dniester region stood the village community. This was the basic cell of life, the structure that organized work, land, justice, leadership, and survival. Its roots stretched far back into prehistory, and its strength was so remarkable that many of its essential features survived almost into modern times. These communities were territorial, but they had likely grown out of older kin-based groups. In some villages, the inhabitants may indeed have shared common ancestry. In others, that was probably not the case. There was no single model for how every village began. What matters is that, in the centuries before the rise of Moldavia as a state, the world east of the Carpathians was almost entirely rural. There were no towns shaping social life, no urban institutions influencing local customs. Everything rested on the village. Because written evidence for this early period is so scarce, reconstructing social life remains difficult. Historians can compare later medieval documents and more recent ethnographic realities. But for the centuries before state formation, archaeology remains the clearest guide. What it suggests is a society with relatively limited, visible differences in wealth. Burials from the 10th to 13th centuries show a striking degree of material similarity, and there is little clear evidence of strong social inequality within local communities. Only a few hoards of coins or ornaments hint that wealth may have been unevenly distributed in some cases. This does not mean society was perfectly equal, but it does suggest that local life was still organized around a broad communal framework, rather than around a sharply divided elite. The key to understanding these communities lies in land and labour. Some scholars once argued that what defined the village was above all collective work, not ownership. But in reality, the organisation of labour and the use of land were inseparable. The whole structure of the community depended on access to arable fields, pastures, forests, and water. These resources were used communally, and cultivated land was not necessarily fixed forever in private hands. Instead, it was often redistributed among families. The right to use land mattered more than an abstract idea of permanent possession. This older way of life survived for a very long time. Even centuries later, travellers through Moldavia still described communities, where land was periodically divided, according to the size of each household. Families received shares based on the number of people they contained, and there was often more land than could be cultivated at once. One part might be sown for a time, while another was left for later use. This reveals a society in which land was abundant in many regions, but its use was regulated by custom and community. The village community was far more than a farming unit. It was an independent social and political body, with economic, administrative, judicial, and fiscal responsibilities. Meetings were not held on a rigid schedule, but whenever needed. The community as a whole could intervene in matters that today might seem private, including disputes within families. It was taxed collectively by outside powers, whether nomadic rulers or later medieval states. It also exercised a degree of legal autonomy, especially in conflicts involving its own members or events that happened within its boundaries. In many ways, the village acted as both a local society and a local government. It protected its interests, enforced duties, and regulated access to resources. Within this framework, the household heads and respected elders played an especially important role. Over time, councils of experienced and influential men emerged, often described as good and old people. These were not simply elderly villagers. They were men whose standing came from experience, authority, and often property or prestige. At first, they served as mediators and guides within the community. But as social differences slowly began to grow, their role became more powerful. They increasingly acted as intermediaries between village communities and external rulers, collecting tribute, organizing labor obligations, and speaking on behalf of the village. In this way, authority gradually concentrated in the hands of a local rural elite. This did not happen overnight, but it marked an important shift. The village was still communal, yet within it, some men now stood above others. This structure has certain similarities to what existed in the Byzantine countryside. There too, communal and individual property coexisted, and villages were often led by councils of elders, or respected men. Similar bodies are also mentioned later in Moldavian towns and villages, which suggests a long continuity of local custom. These elders were consulted on matters affecting the whole community, and their role likely went back to centuries before formal towns or states emerged in the region. The fact that such institutions appear again and again across time suggests that they were deeply embedded in local society. Every village community also had a clearly marked territory. Boundaries were not vague ideas, but real and meaningful lines in the landscape, often marked with stones or other signs. These limits enclosed not only the houses of the village, but also its fields, forests, pastures, and waters. The success of communal life depended on maintaining these boundaries, because only within them could the cycle of redistribution and shared use function properly. Without clear borders, the rights of the community would collapse. The village, then, was not just a cluster of homes, it was a bounded social territory, with its own internal order. As social stratification developed more clearly, another institution emerged, the local lord known as the knez. This figure appears in many Romanian lands as well as in Slavic regions, though his exact functions could vary. In Moldavia, kneses and judges become visible in written records during the 15th century, but the institution itself must have older roots. A village normally had one knez, and the office appears to have been hereditary from an early stage. This matters because it shows the slow transformation of local leadership from communal authority into more stable and family-based power. In some regions organised under Romanian customary law, villagers even owed labour services to the estates of their kneses. That reveals a society already moving away from strict communal equality and toward a more layered, rural hierarchy. Even so, the community did not lose all control. It still had the right to approve the acceptance of outsiders and to regulate the levies placed upon it. Foreigners could sometimes be allowed to live within a village, but they did not automatically enjoy all the rights of full members. In at least some cases, archaeology suggests that groups of newcomers were absorbed into local communities over time. Certain cemeteries show individuals with physical traits pointing to Eastern origins, buried among local people, rather than in separate zones. This suggests that outsiders could be integrated fairly quickly into the village body. The community was not closed beyond all change, but it remained protective of its privileges and identity. Daily life within the village also involved many communal duties. Members had to clear forests, maintain pastures, fence plots, and take part in shared work necessary for the community's survival. Refusing such obligations could lead to penalties, especially loss of access to communal lands. This shows again how deeply rights and labour were tied together. A person did not simply own land in an individual sense. One belonged to a community and, through fulfilling duties, retained access to its resources. Even priests do not seem to have stood above this system in the earlier centuries. The village clergy often had to cultivate their own land and perform ordinary labour like everyone else. This suggests two things. First, liturgical work alone did not provide enough support for survival. Second, priests did not yet enjoy the broad privileges that clergy would later acquire in more developed states. In some places, their social standing may even have been quite modest. This is strikingly similar to parts of Byzantium, where some clergy remained economically dependent and socially humble. In the Romanian lands, many priests were of peasant origin, had little formal education, and struggled to master the ecclesiastical language used in worship. Their role in the community was important, but it was not yet one of great material privilege. Only later, after the formation of Moldavia as a state, did members of the clergy begin to benefit more regularly from land grants, tax exemptions, and broader judicial authority. This older world of village autonomy also helps explain a later misunderstanding that some regions of Moldavia had once existed as little republics before the rise of the state. In reality, such claims are unreliable when examined closely. Regions like Câmpulung Moldovenesc, Vrancea, and Tegesi did preserve certain traditions of self-government and local privilege. But those privileges were tied mostly to military service, frontier duties, and special regional roles, not to the survival of fully independent pre-state republics. Some older descriptions of these regions are full of inaccuracies and contradictions. They reflect later political agendas more than historical reality. Yet behind the exaggeration lies something important. These regions did preserve stronger local traditions because they were borderlands, with strategic importance. Their inhabitants defended roads, mountain passes, or frontier zones against foreign threats, and for that reason they enjoyed greater autonomy than some others. Rejecting the legend of peasant republics does not mean denying the existence of local political structures before the rise of Moldavia. On the contrary, there are strong reasons to believe that, before a centralized state emerged, the lands east of the Carpathians were organized through confederations of village communities. These were not states in the full medieval sense, but they were more than isolated villages. They were larger networks of communities united by common interests, local leadership, and the need for collective defense. Such confederations likely arose from the internal evolution of rural society itself, but also from outside pressure. The local population had to protect itself not only from Turkic nomads moving through the steppe, but also from neighbouring medieval states seeking influence or control. Long before the rise of organised medieval states in the Carpathian region, there are strong hints that more complex political structures already existed among the local populations. One striking clue comes from a papal letter dated to the early 13th century, which refers to Romanian religious leaders operating in the Carpathian Bend. In the Middle Ages, religious authority was rarely separate from political organisation. Where there were bishops, there was usually some form of structured power behind them. This suggests that local Romanian communities were not just loose villages, but part of a broader political framework capable of supporting ecclesiastical authority. Literary sources also offer intriguing glimpses into this early world. A German epic mentions a ruler associated with the land of the Vlachs, implying that by around the year 1200, a recognizable political entity already existed somewhere in the Carpathian area. Other references link these people with neighbouring groups such as the Rus, Greeks, Poles, and steppe nomads, placing them firmly within the political and military landscape of Eastern Europe. There are also accounts describing Romanians taking part in conflicts between rival princes in the lands to the north. Such involvement would not have been possible without some level of organisation, leadership, and military coordination. Archaeological discoveries reinforce this picture, revealing a growing number of weapons and improved military equipment, suggesting that local societies were becoming more capable of defending themselves and projecting power. While sedentary communities were slowly developing their own structures, the nomadic world of the steppe followed a very different path. At its foundation stood the clan, a group of families connected by shared ancestry and bound together by strong traditions. These clans formed the core of nomadic life. They followed strict social rules, including marriage outside the clan, obligations of revenge, and customs regulating inheritance and family structure. Yet even within these tightly bound groups, inequality existed. Some individuals were buried with little or nothing, while others were laid to rest with gold ornaments, weapons, and richly decorated objects. These differences reflect a society where wealth and status could vary greatly, even within the same community. Wealth in the steppe was measured above all in livestock. Horses, sheep, cattle, and camels were not only essential for survival, but also symbols of prestige. A powerful leader might own vast herds, and the display of such wealth during gatherings or ceremonies reinforced his status. This concentration of wealth created a clear hierarchy, with elite families standing above ordinary members of the clan. Clans did not exist in isolation. Several clans formed tribes, and tribes could come together into larger alliances when needed. These tribal groupings were not fixed or stable. Their number and composition changed over time, shaped by migration, conflict, and shifting alliances. Some tribes dominated certain regions, controlling key pastures and migration routes, while others were pushed aside or absorbed. The steppe was a constantly shifting political landscape where unity was fragile and temporary. Unlike settled societies, nomadic groups rarely formed lasting centralized states. Their way of life encouraged independence and mobility rather than fixed authority. Each tribe controlled its own territory and followed its own leadership. In times of peace, this often led to fragmentation, with groups acting independently. But when faced with external threats, such as the arrival of new nomadic peoples, these tribes could unite quickly. This pattern repeated itself again and again. When one group was threatened, it would join forces with others, only to break apart again once the danger passed. Leadership among the nomads was typically hereditary, but not always in the way one might expect. Power did not necessarily pass from father to son. Instead, it often moved sideways within the family, from brother to brother, or from uncle to nephew. This system helped maintain a balance within elite families, but it also created tension and competition. Decisions were not made by rulers alone. Councils of leading figures, drawn from the aristocracy, played a crucial role in guiding tribal policy. These councils could support a leader, but they could also oppose him if he acted against the interests of the group. Conflict was a constant feature of nomadic life. Rival tribes competed for pasture lands, livestock, and influence. These struggles could be intense and destructive, sometimes leading to fragmentation or even the collapse of entire tribal unions. In some cases, nomadic groups even turned to outside powers to resolve their disputes, inviting foreign intervention with long-term consequences. Such divisions prevented the emergence of strong, unified states across the steppe. Despite this lack of centralization, nomadic societies were highly organized in other ways, especially in warfare. Every adult male was both a herder and a warrior. From a young age, individuals learned to ride, hunt, and fight. Their armies were composed entirely of cavalry, capable of moving rapidly across vast distances. This mobility gave them a decisive advantage over slower, more heavily organized enemies. They could strike suddenly, retreat quickly, and avoid prolonged engagements when necessary. Their tactics were sophisticated and effective. Nomadic warriors often used feigned retreats to lure enemies into disorganized pursuit, only to turn back and attack. They avoided fighting in terrain that limited their mobility, such as forests or narrow valleys, preferring open landscapes where their cavalry could operate freely. Their primary weapon was the bow, and they were renowned for their skill in mounted archery. Other weapons such as sabres, spears and axes were also used, though less prominently. Nomadic camps themselves could become defensive structures. Wagons were arranged in circles to create temporary fortifications, protecting people, animals, and supplies. This flexibility allowed them to adapt quickly to changing circumstances, whether on the move or in battle. Even when facing stronger enemies, they could retreat into these mobile defences and survive. Economically, nomadic life revolved around livestock, but it was not isolated from the wider world. Trade, raiding, and tribute all played important roles. Nomads exchanged animals, furs, and captives for luxury goods such as textiles and spices. They also demanded tribute from weaker neighbours, including settled populations and even powerful empires. In some cases, they served as mercenaries, offering their military skills in exchange for payment or political advantage. The relationship between nomads and sedentary societies was complex. On one hand, nomads could be devastating raiders, attacking villages and towns in search of wealth. On the other hand, they were valued allies, capable of turning the balance in regional conflicts. Rulers across Europe and Asia often sought their support, recognizing the power of their cavalry and the effectiveness of their tactics. In this world, the line between survival and warfare was thin. The movement of herds meant the movement of armed groups. Every migration was also a military operation, ready to defend or attack at any moment. This constant readiness made nomadic societies both formidable and unpredictable. For neighbouring communities, they were a source of fear and destruction, but also an unavoidable part of the political landscape. The Romanian population living east of the Carpathian Mountains was, to a very large extent, Christian. The roots of that Christianity went back deep into the past, and both archaeology and language preserve traces of that long continuity. Religious objects, crosses, and artifacts marked with Christian symbols have been found across the Carpathian Danube region, suggesting that Christianity did not arrive suddenly in the High Middle Ages, but had survived there for centuries. In a landscape often crossed by migrations and invasions, this matters a great deal. The Romanized population of the region appears to have remained the main Christian element for a very long time, especially because most of the incoming peoples around them were not initially Christian. That gave religion an important role not only in worship, but also in identity. It marked a line between the local population and many of the groups moving across the frontier. Yet this Christianity did not remain unchanged. The collapse of older Roman and early church structures in the Balkans, followed by Slavic and Bulgar settlement, deeply affected the religious world north of the Danube as well. Many older terms connected with formal church organisation disappeared from everyday use, while the most basic words for worship and sacred objects survived. Later, as the Slavic liturgy spread, and the religious influence of the Bulgarian church grew stronger, the Romanian language absorbed a large number of South Slavic church terms. These words entered not only religious vocabulary in a narrow sense, but also the language of prayer, fasting, repentance, saints, liturgy, funerals, and monastic life. Some of them had originally come from Greek into Slavic, and from there into Romanian. Others had followed even more complicated paths, changing meaning as they moved between peoples and centuries. What this shows is that Romanian Christianity was ancient but also adaptive. It preserved deep roots while absorbing the liturgical and cultural influences of the Orthodox Slavic world. This process seems to have unfolded gradually. It was not completed in a single century, nor was it the result of a single political event. Christianity in the lands north of the Danube had to survive through periods of instability, weak ecclesiastical organization, and shifting political control. That explains why local church structures developed slowly. The population seems to have remained Christian, but formal hierarchy, episcopal control, and institutional stability lagged behind. The region was too exposed to invasions, too politically fragmented, and too often caught between stronger neighbouring powers for church organisation to develop smoothly. Burial customs provide one of the clearest windows into this complicated story. For a long time, many communities in the Carpathian Danube area practiced cremation, while later centuries saw a gradual transition to inhumation. During the 9th and 10th centuries, both burial types coexisted in some cemeteries. But by the 10th and 11th centuries, cremation largely disappeared and inhumation became dominant. This shift is important because inhumation had long been associated with Christian burial in much of Europe and the Mediterranean world. The question, then, is why cremation lasted so long in the North Danubian regions. The answer may lie in the isolated and informal character of local Christianity. In remote or unstable regions, older pre-Christian customs may continue for a long time, even inside communities that already see themselves as Christian. There are cases that strongly suggest exactly this kind of overlap. Some cremation burials have produced Christian symbols, including crosses and objects clearly linked to Christian belief. That means cremation cannot always be dismissed as a simple sign of paganism. In some cases, it may reflect Christian communities that continue to preserve older funeral habits. Similar situations are known elsewhere in Europe, where newly converted, or only partially integrated, Christian populations continue to practice older rites for generations. The North Danubian world seems to fit that pattern. Christianity survived there, but often in ways less formal, less closely supervised, and more locally blended with inherited customs. The slow development of church organisation north of the Danube also explains why Romanian clergy remained for a long time under the influence of external ecclesiastical centres. Bishops and metropolitans from the Bulgarian and later the Galician world exercised authority over regions that had no stable local hierarchy of their own. The archaeological record reflects this mixed environment. Religious objects of Byzantine type appear alongside examples connected with the Rus world. This suggests that the local church stood between several Orthodox spheres, receiving liturgical books, symbols, and influence from both the Balkans and the East Slavic lands. During the age of the Asen rulers and the revival of Bulgarian power, ties with Balkan Orthodox centres remained strong. At the same time, churches connected with Kiev and Galicia also supplied liturgical texts and religious influence. There are signs that sacred writings in Greek and Slavonic did not merely arrive in the region, but were copied, transmitted, and perhaps even translated there. This circulation of texts mattered greatly. It enriched Christian vocabulary, deepened religious practice, and helped shape a moral and spiritual world that was becoming more clearly orthodox in character. By the early 13th century, we have strong evidence that some kind of church hierarchy was already in place among the Romanians of the Carpathian Bend. A papal letter mentioning Romanian bishops, though hostile in tone, indirectly confirms that such a structure existed. The broader political setting matters here as well. After the Bulgarian church was organised and later elevated in status, its authority extended north of the Danube. When Byzantium conquered Bulgaria, church structures were reshaped again, and Greek influence intensified alongside the continued use of Old Church Slavonic. Later, with the rise of the Second Bulgarian Empire, the church at Tarnovo regained great importance. Meanwhile, the church of Kievan Rus, and later the See of Halic, expanded westward and southward. The Romanian lands lay between these competing zones of influence. That meant local Christianity was never isolated. It developed under constant pressure from stronger ecclesiastical powers around it. But religion in the region was shaped not only by Orthodox influences. It also developed in the face of two major challenges: the pagan nomads of the steppe and Catholic missionary expansion from the Hungarian kingdom. In that environment, the church became more than a spiritual institution. It became a defender of local society. It supported the local population, not only against military pressure, but also against religious absorption from outside. This is one reason why, over time, religious identity and ethnic identity became more closely tied among the Romanians. To be Orthodox increasingly meant to belong to the same historical community. The nomadic world beyond the settled villages followed a very different religious path. Some medieval authors claimed that the steppe peoples had no religion at all. But this only reflects the prejudice of writers who recognized only the great universal faiths as real religions. In truth, the Turkic nomads had rich and complex belief systems of their own. They revered the sky, the earth, waters, and natural forces. Above all stood the great heavenly deity often understood as the ruler of cosmic order. Around this central figure existed a world full of spirits, sacred places, and ritual specialists. Shamanic practices played an important role, especially in healing, protection, divination, and maintaining the balance between the living world and the unseen one. The shaman was not only a ritual figure, but also healer, mediator, and spiritual guide. Some Byzantine writers misunderstood this world and assumed that the nomads saw death as the final end of existence. Yet their burial customs prove otherwise. The dead were often buried with objects, horses, and offerings, all of which point clearly to a belief in the afterlife. Their funerary rituals were elaborate and meaningful, centered on the idea that the dead continued to exist in another realm. In this, the steppe peoples were no less religious than their Christian neighbours. Their beliefs were simply organised in different ways. During the first centuries of the second millennium, Christianity and Islam both pushed into the steppe world. The struggle between those two great religions was not confined to the Near East or the Iberian Peninsula. It also extended into the lands north of the Black and Caspian Seas. Christian missions came from Rus, Byzantium, Hungary, and Georgia. Islam reached the steppes through trade routes and the influence of the Islamic world to the east and south. Some writers claim that entire nomadic peoples had adopted Islam, but such reports are usually exaggerated. In reality, the nomads of the steppe seem to have remained resistant to outside religions for a long time. Their old customs and burial practices persisted well into later centuries. Conversions did happen, but usually under special conditions. Some nomads adopted a new religion when they entered the service of a foreign ruler, sought asylum in another country, or aligned themselves with a powerful neighbouring state. Christian missions among the Pechenegs, for example, appear to have had limited success. But the Cumans proved more open to Christianity, especially in regions influenced by Hungary. A bishopric was created specifically for them in the lands beyond the Carpathians, and Cuman groups serving the rulers of Georgia also accepted Christianity in the 12th century. Even after the Mongol conquest, pockets of Christian Cumans survived in the steppe. This shows that the nomads were not completely closed to religious change, but such change was selective, uneven, and often tied to politics, rather than mass conversion. Steppe religion also included a rich world of myths and legendary ancestors. Among the ogres, for example, stories about a great ancestral hero circulated widely. In some traditions, he and his followers were guided by a miraculous wolf, an animal of divine importance leading the people toward conquest or destiny. Variations of this type of myth appear among many peoples across Eurasia. Such stories were not simple entertainment. They gave meaning to migration, warfare, and tribal identity. They explained why a people existed, where it had come from, and how it was destined to move through the world. The clearest evidence for nomadic religious practice comes from funerary archaeology. Turkic burials often took place in older barrows or under newly raised mounds. The construction of a new mound seems to have been reserved mainly for elite burials. Written descriptions of the funerals of major steppe leaders speak of horses slaughtered in great numbers, warriors sacrificed or buried with the dead, and large earth mounds raised over the grave. These accounts sound dramatic, but they are supported in many ways by archaeology. Such burials reveal a world in which status, loyalty, and afterlife were closely linked. A ruler did not go alone into death. His horse, weapons, and sometimes even human attendants followed him. The burial of horses was especially important. Parts of the horse or its gear were often placed in the grave, and in some cases the animal itself was sacrificed and buried as part of the ritual. Offerings of meat and drink could also be deposited with the dead. Such practices have very deep roots across the Eurasian steppe, stretching back to the Scythians and continuing through the medieval period. They reveal the central place of the horse not only in daily life and warfare, but also in spiritual imagination. To the nomad, the horse was wealth, movement, prestige, and companion in death. Another striking feature of Turkic funerary culture was the erection of anthropomorphic stone statues near the graves. These statues often faced east and held cups or other symbolic objects. Medieval travellers recorded them with fascination, and archaeological work has shown that they were indeed common in many steppe regions. Some may have represented the dead themselves, perhaps idealized as noble ancestors. Others may have had a more ritual or commemorative role. In some regions, similar figures were made not of stone but of wood, though such wooden examples rarely survived. These statues form part of a wider funerary landscape that included altars, mounds, and ritual spaces, showing that steppe burial was not a simple matter of disposing of the body, but a highly structured sacred act. The graves left behind by the Romanian population east of the Carpathian Mountains offer one of the clearest, and at the same time one of the most incomplete, windows into their world. So far, only a limited number of cemeteries and scattered burials have been discovered, which says as much about the state of research as it does about the past itself. Even with this limited evidence, a broad pattern can still be seen. During the early Middle Ages, cremation remained common for a long time, but by the 10th century, a major change was underway. Burial by inhumation gradually replaced cremation, and for a time, both customs existed side by side. This moment of transition is especially important, because it reflects not only a change in ritual practice, but a deeper transformation in belief, social order, and the visible expression of Christian identity. One cemetery in particular illustrates this shift with unusual clarity. There, almost every grave belonged to an inhumation burial, while only a tiny number still preserved traces of cremation. The cremated remains were sparse and placed in urns, buried close to the surface, while the inhumation graves followed a much more regular pattern. Most of the bodies were laid on an east-west axis, usually with the head to the west and the feet to the east, though small seasonal variations appear in the alignment. That kind of orientation strongly suggests a Christian framework, or at least a society moving steadily in that direction. The bodies were usually laid on their backs, most often with the arms either stretched beside the body or bent with the hands placed over the abdomen or chest. Such details may seem small, but repeated across dozens of burials, they reveal a burial custom that had become increasingly standardized. At the same time, these burials were not all identical. Some bodies were found in crouched positions, rather than fully extended, and in several cases the condition of the graves made it impossible to reconstruct the original placement of the limbs. Grave goods also varied. Almost half of the burials in that cemetery contained objects placed with the dead, and these appeared far more often with women than with men. Female graves yielded ornaments, beads, rings, earrings, spindle whorls, and decorative items, while male graves more often included knives or pottery. This contrast suggests that dress and adornment played an important role in how women were represented in death, while tools and vessels mattered more in male burials. Yet even with these differences, the overall picture remains one of a relatively cohesive burial tradition, rather than sharply divided social classes. For a long time, some scholars tried to assign cemeteries of this kind to Slavic populations simply on the basis of physical anthropology or older assumptions about the region. But that explanation is too narrow. Many of the objects found in these graves have close parallels in clearly Romanian contexts, and the biological features noted in the skeletons are not exclusive to any one ethnic group. In other words, these burial grounds cannot be pushed automatically into a foreign category simply because they belong to a frontier zone. On the contrary, they fit well within a broader local Christian population that was itself diverse, fluid, and shaped by long contact with neighbouring peoples. Other cemeteries from the same world reveal even more complexity. In some burial grounds, most graves follow the expected east-west alignment and Christian supine position, but a small number differ sharply. There are graves with bodies crouched in unusual ways, graves with different orientations, and even pits that contain no human remains at all, but animal bones instead. In one cemetery, such unusual burials clustered in a particular part of the site, suggesting that a minority group within the community may have preserved different customs. That minority may have been ethnically distinct, religiously different, or perhaps simply attached to older funeral traditions. Yet the fact that they were still buried in the same cemetery as everyone else is very important. It suggests not separation, but coexistence. Even if some members of the village had different origins or customs, they were still treated as part of the same local community. Another cemetery makes this even more striking. There, most graves again follow the east-west Christian pattern, but a smaller number run north-south or south-north, something much less typical for the local Christian burial world. In a few of these graves, the skeletal features point toward Eastern or steppe-related origins. Some even show marks of trepanation, a practice rarely associated with the settled Romanian countryside, but better known from broader Eurasian traditions. These graves also contain a somewhat different selection of objects, including horse gear and other items that do not fit comfortably into the standard village burial pattern. Yet once again, these foreign burials were not set apart in a completely separate cemetery. They were scattered among the others. That tells us something essential about life in these frontier societies. Foreigners did not always remain strangers. They could be absorbed into local communities, live beside them, marry into them, and eventually be buried in the same ground. Smaller clusters of graves found across Moldavia reinforce this picture. Some include only burials aligned in the Christian East-West manner, while others show more variety in orientation and ritual. This may reflect local difference in burial practice at a time when the transition from cremation to inhumation was still fresh, or it may point again to the presence of outsiders within village communities. Either way, the pattern is clear. Burial customs in the region were moving toward Christian uniformity, but the process was not perfectly complete, and traces of diversity remained visible for generations. If the burial record of the local Romanian population feels incomplete, the funerary evidence for the Turkic nomads is much larger. though it brings its own difficulties. In fact, burials are almost the only substantial archaeological trace of their presence in the lands east of the Carpathians. Across the wider steppe corridor from the Prut to the Volga, thousands of such graves are known, and even in the Carpathian Dniester region, the number is considerable. These nomadic burial assemblages are therefore central not only for understanding their presence, but also for reconstructing their beliefs, social hierarchy, military identity, and seasonal movements. Most of these nomadic burials do not appear in large, orderly cemeteries like those of village communities. Instead, they are usually isolated or grouped in very small numbers, often only a handful of graves placed into the same mound. In some cases, even those few graves may not belong to the same exact moment. This already tells us something important. Nomadic, funerary landscapes were not organised in the same way as settled village cemeteries. Their dead were buried as part of a mobile world, one in which people moved with herds across large distances, returning at times to known burial grounds but not building stable cemeteries in the village sense. The barrow was central to this burial tradition. Most nomadic graves in Moldavia were placed beneath mounds, and only a very small number are known without them. Yet even here, the nomads usually did not build entirely new mounds. Instead, they often reused older, prehistoric barrows that already dotted the southern lowlands and the valleys of major rivers. These ancient mounds had been raised long before by Bronze Age peoples, or later steppe groups such as the Scythians and Sarmatians. For the medieval nomads, this was practical. There was no need to raise a fresh mound every time when the landscape already offered so many prominent markers. But the choice may also have had symbolic meaning. By burying their dead in these old barrows, the nomads inserted themselves into a much older steppe tradition, whether consciously or not. This reuse of ancient mounds also explains why the distribution of medieval nomadic burials overlaps so closely with much older burial landscapes. The same steppe ecology that had favoured earlier nomads favoured the Pechenegs, Uzes, and Cumans as well. Burial mounds cluster in the lowlands, especially in the Bugiak and along the lower Dniester, and follow the courses of major rivers. They appear far less often in densely forested uplands or beyond the great rivers into the hilly interior. This distribution is no accident. It mirrors the economic needs of the nomads themselves. These were pastoral peoples who needed open grasslands, water access, and routes for seasonal movement. Their dead were buried where their living communities moved and camped. The placement of these graves reveals a remarkably clear environmental pattern. Most of them stand close to rivers, lakes, or marshy water sources. That is exactly what we would expect from steppe pastoralists, so whose movements depended on grazing and access to water. The clustering of graves in southern Moldavia, especially in the Bugiak and along the lower Dniester, suggests that this was the main centre of nomadic occupation. From there, the herding groups likely shifted seasonally. In winter, they moved toward the lower Danube and the lakes near the Black Sea, where the climate was milder. In summer, when the Bugiak dried under the heat, they drove their herds northward along the Dniester, the Prut, the Barlad, and their tributaries. The distribution of burial assemblages reflects exactly this rhythm of life. In terms of grave form, most of the nomadic burials contain adult individuals, and surprisingly, few children are known. That raises important questions. Not everyone in nomadic society may have been entitled to burial under a mound, or perhaps children were buried in ways less visible archaeologically. Most bodies were laid on their backs, and most graves follow a west-east orientation, though other directions also appear. North-south burials exist, but they are much less common. The body position is usually simple, with the arms stretched beside the body or slightly bent. Double burials are rare. There is one case of a face-down burial, but such examples are exceptional. What stands out, instead, is a general consistency in the basic body placement, even as grave goods and mound use varied. Those grave goods are crucial for understanding nomadic life. Some were worn by the dead, such as jewellery or dress fittings. Others were placed in the grave as ritual deposits. Weapons, horse gear, knives, coins, bows reinforced with bone or antler, sabres, stirrups, buckles, kettles, pottery, and even the fittings of wooden containers appear among them. Such objects tell us that these graves often belonged to mounted warriors. They also reveal rank and occupation. A grave with stirrups, a sabre, and horse equipment does not belong to the same world as a simple village burial with a spindle whorl or a modest earring. Even where material wealth differs, the military identity of nomadic male burials is especially prominent. When the burial evidence from Moldavia is compared with that from Wallachia and Dobruja, a much fuller picture emerges. Across the whole region outside the Carpathians, the same basic pattern repeats itself. The nomads favoured lowland steppe zones and river valleys. They rarely penetrated into the forested highlands west of the Siret or into the sub-Carpathian hills. Even when they moved up the major river corridors, they did not settle deeply into the wooded interior. That avoidance is highly significant. It shows that the steppe nomads remained faithful to the ecological logic of their pastoral world. They could approach the edges of the hills, but they did not truly belong there. Their presence remained strongest where grassland, mobility, and water made mounted pastoral life possible. This is one of the clearest differences between the settled Romanian communities and the Turkic nomads. The village cemeteries of the local population are rooted in stable settlement, communal memory, and gradually standardized Christian burial. The nomadic graves are tied instead to movement, mounds, horses, military equipment, and the rhythms of transhuman life. One burial world belongs to villages, family continuity, and a religious system moving toward uniformity. The other belongs to the open steppe, older barrows, warrior display, and a mobile society that left few settlements behind, but many graves across the lowland landscape. At the same time, the two worlds were not fully separate. Just as foreigners appear in local cemeteries, elements of cultural contact can also be detected in the nomadic burial record. Certain graves are difficult to classify neatly. Some contain mixed features. Others may belong to periods when older Pecheneg, Uzes, Cuman, and later Tatar traditions overlapped. This warns us against overly rigid ethnic labelling. The frontier east of the Carpathians was not a fixed border between pure cultures. It was a zone of constant interaction, absorption, and adaptation. Still, the overall picture remains powerful. The Romanian burial record speaks of continuity, Christianity, village identity, and a gradual ritual stabilization. The nomadic burial record speaks of movement, lowland routes, reused barrows, warrior culture, and seasonal occupation of the steppe. Through their dead, both societies reveal how differently they lived. And in the contrast between their cemeteries and mounds, we can see one of the deepest truths about the medieval outer Carpathian world. It was shaped by the meeting of two very different ways of inhabiting the land, one rooted and communal, the other mobile and pastoral, each leaving behind a distinct geography of memory. Another revealing aspect of the Turkic burial record in the Carpathian Dniester region is how small the burial groups usually are. The same pattern appears in the Romanian plain as well. Most sites contain only a few graves, not large cemeteries. That suggests two things. First, the nomadic groups who passed through or settled in the lower Danube region were probably not very numerous in any one place. Second, they did not remain there for long stretches of time. Their world was one of movement, not permanence. Their dead were left behind in scattered clusters, but their living communities continued to move with the rhythm of pasture, season, and military necessity. If we turn from burial grounds to artistic life, the contrast between the settled Romanian communities and the nomadic steppe peoples becomes just as striking. In southern Moldavia, the number of surviving objects that can clearly be called works of art is not large. But that does not mean the local population lacked imagination, skill, or a sense of beauty. Their world was constrained by hard realities. Life was shaped by tribute demands, the danger of raids, the late development of towns and states, and the long weakening of direct ties with Byzantium, the great artistic centre of southeastern Europe. Under such conditions, rural society had little chance to create monumental architecture or luxury arts on a grand scale. The churches of local communities were most likely wooden, modest, and small, built not to impress a distant world but to serve the needs of a village. Because of that, the best clues to local aesthetic life come not from great buildings or famous masterpieces, but from smaller objects used every day. Personal ornaments and decorated household items reveal the artistic sensibility of these communities, far better than any monumental remains. Beads, pendants, earrings, bracelets, rings, and metal mounts show that local people cared about appearance and decorative detail. These objects were made from copper, bronze, silver, glass, bone, and horn, and they were produced through techniques such as casting, hammering, pressing, inlaying, and wirework. They do not belong to an isolated artistic world, but to a broader taste shared across much of southern, central, and eastern Europe. In other words, even a relatively poor rural society was still connected to a wider visual culture. Pottery offers an even clearer example. Nearly all wheel-made pottery from these settlements was decorated. Fine vessels of grey or yellowish fabric were sometimes polished before firing and adorned with horizontal lines or net-like patterns. The more common red pottery was decorated with wavy combing, parallel grooves, dimples, notches, and impressed signs. Even the bottoms of pots and bowls often carried symbols in relief, especially crosses or concentric circles. Occasionally, animal figures also appeared on ceramic surfaces. These were not luxury products made for elites. They were ordinary vessels. Yet their decoration shows that utility and beauty were not separated in village life. Even a cooking pot or storage jar could carry a visual language of pattern, rhythm, and meaning. Wood, though largely vanished from the archaeological record, must also have played a major role in local artistic expression. Moldavia was rich in timber, and later Romanian woodcarving traditions show just how deeply rooted that craft became. Gates, houses, fences, household tools, and personal belongings were all later decorated with carved motifs that combined beauty and usefulness. It is very likely that medieval communities already worked in a similar spirit, even if the objects themselves have not survived. Unlike wood, a few stone carvings do remain, and they are suggestive. In at least 2 cases, rough stone sculptures appear to represent human faces in highly simplified form. They are modest objects, but important because they hint that representational art existed even in this rural world. Writing, on the other hand, remains much harder to trace. There is no firm proof yet that writing was widely used in the lands east of the Carpathians during this period. But it would be surprising if no religious books circulated there at all. Given the region's ties with Bulgaria, Byzantium, and Rus, liturgical manuscripts almost certainly existed. Some may even have been copied locally. Yet literacy must have been very limited, probably confined mostly to clergy. Many supposed traces of writing found in archaeology are uncertain and cannot support strong conclusions. So while it is likely that sacred texts were known, the written word remained rare and socially restricted. As for folklore, very little can be known directly from the archaeology. But later, ethnographic evidence preserves many old beliefs, songs, rituals, and seasonal customs that may go back to the medieval period or even earlier. Some were likely pre-Christian in origin and were gradually reinterpreted within a Christian framework. Rather than destroying every older tradition, Christianity often absorbed and reshaped them. This means that behind the formal religion of the village there survived a deeper layer of seasonal ritual, agricultural magic, protective customs, and mythic imagination. The artistic world of the Turkic nomads was different in form, but no less revealing. Their surviving art consists mainly of metal, bone, horn, antler, and stone. Much of it comes from graves. Weapons, horse gear, belt fittings, ornaments, and ritual objects often show engraved geometric patterns and sometimes stylized animal designs. These works were practical, but they also carried visual power. A sword hilt, a quiver fitting, or a decorated mount was not only a useful object, it was part of a warrior's appearance, identity, and status. The nomadic world did not produce cathedrals or painted churches, but it did create a visual culture tied to movement, riding, and display. The most famous artistic legacy of the nomads is the stone statue. These figures, strongly associated with the Cumans, are among the most distinctive monuments of the medieval steppe. They depict both men and women and preserve valuable details about dress, hair, jewellery, and bodily form. In that sense, they are not only works of art, but also visual records of nomadic life. Their deeper roots go back to older traditions in Central Asia, which themselves had probably absorbed influences from earlier Iranian-speaking peoples of the steppe. So even here, the nomads were part of a much longer Eurasian artistic tradition. One such statue was discovered in what is now the Republic of Moldova. It represented the bust of a man with a moustache, a small beard, and eyes rendered in a distinctly Eastern style. Because it was found near a burial mound, it is believed to have originally stood in connection with the grave. What makes it especially interesting is that, in some respects, it resembles much earlier statues from Central Asia more than the better-known Cuman figures of the North Pontic steppe. Most later, steppe statues are taller, more elaborate, and often show seated figures with necklaces, medallions, or vessels held at the belly. Yet simpler examples do exist, suggesting that the artistic tradition itself was more varied than it first appears. Across the steppe, north of the Black Sea, more than 1,000 such statues are known. Medieval travellers described them, and later Russians called them stone-old women, though the original Turkic word referred more broadly to ancestral or memorial figures. The greatest concentration of these statues lies far to the east, between the middle Dnieper and the northern Donets, and northeast of the Sea of Azov. West of the Dniester, however, they become very rare. This already tells us something important. The lower Danube region was touched by the wider artistic world of the Cumans, but it was not its main centre. The strongest concentration of that sculptural tradition lay farther east, deeper in the heart of the steppe. In artistic terms, the later Turkic nomads were often more conservative than innovative. Many of their visual traditions were borrowed from earlier nomadic peoples of Eurasia. Compared with the refined metalwork of the Scythians, Sarmatians, Avars, Khazars, or even the early Hungarians, the artistic production of the Pechenegs, Uzes, and Cumans often appears less rich and less inventive. Their military power did not always produce an equally impressive artistic flowering. In that sense, one could say that the steppe art of the 10th to 13th centuries preserved older traditions rather than creating a great new artistic age of its own. Writing among the Turkic populations is also difficult to assess. The older Turkic world had already produced inscriptions centuries earlier in Inner Asia, and related peoples certainly possessed at least limited traditions of writing. But in the Western steppes, whatever written culture existed seems to have remained narrow in use and weak in preservation. If literature existed, it was above all oral. Heroic tales, tribal legends, and ancestral epics must have circulated widely, even if they were never written down locally. Traditions connected with the great ancestral heroes of the Turkic world, especially those centered on the Oghuz cycle, almost certainly reached the steppe between the Danube and the Urals as spoken poetry rather than as fixed texts. Music too formed part of this world. Some written sources mention Turkic war horns instead of drums, while others describe skilled musicians at the courts of Turkic rulers. The Cumans were certainly not strangers to music. Medieval sources refer to Cuman musicians, and the surviving vocabulary of their language includes terms for music and instruments. There is even a stone statue of a man holding what appears to be a stringed instrument, and one grave has yielded a pear-shaped instrument resembling those of the wider Turkic world. So although little survives, it is clear that the nomads did sing, play, and remember through sound as well as through speech. For decades, the medieval ethnic and political landscape of the lower Danube has been one of the most debated subjects in regional history. Many questions remain unsettled, and some interpretations have been shaped less by evidence than by modern national agendas. Because of that, the subject often needs to be explained again from the ground up. The history of this frontier cannot be understood through simple slogans or inherited assumptions. It was a zone of long contact, shifting power and overlapping peoples, and any serious attempt to explain it must return to the evidence itself. Once the pastoral tribes of the Eurasian steppe took control of the lands north of the Danube Delta, the local Romanian population entered into direct and lasting contact with Turkic nomads. This was not a short episode. It lasted for centuries. The nomadic groups involved were not all the same. The strongest role seems to have been played by the Pechenegs, and later, the Cumans, but the Uzis, the Brodniks, and probably the Berendei must also be taken into account. The balance between these groups changed over time, and so did their political situation. What remained constant was the fact that they ruled the lowlands and came into continuous contact with the settled communities living to the north and west. The first major Pecheneg intervention known from written sources took place at the end of the 9th century, when they drove the Hungarians out of the lands known as Etelköz. Their move into the Bugiak and the Baragan did not happen all at once. It was gradual. Later came the Uzis, then the Cumans, and with them, the wider reorganization of the steppe world. Everything changed again with the Mongol invasion in the 13th century. That great wave of conquest broke the independent development of the Turkic tribes north of the Black Sea. Some were killed, some fled to neighbouring lands, and others were forced to accept the rule of the Golden Horde. In the lower Danube region, many of the nomads who had lived there before disappeared from the political scene, only to be replaced by new groups under Mongol domination. Archaeology makes this shift especially clear. After the Mongol takeover, burial evidence across the lands between the Volga and the Dniester becomes more numerous, suggesting new population movements and new arrangements of power. Some of these later groups may have included migrants from the Rozes region, including communities known in the Russes world as the Black Caps. In a few cases, burials found in the Bugiak seem to have close parallels there, which points to movement organised or permitted by the rulers of the Golden Horde. It is even possible that some Cumans who fled from Hungary in the late 13th century passed back into the steppe and settled for a time in lands north of the Danube. By then, the old independent tribal world of the Pechenegs and Cumans, was gone. In its place, a new Turkic-Mongol frontier society was beginning to form. This is important because it means the political position of the nomads changed over time. The Turkic communities living in southern Moldavia around the year 900 were not in the same situation as those living there around 1300. Their degree of independence, their relationship with larger powers, and even their ethnic composition shifted. Yet throughout all of these changes, one fact remained the same. They were in direct contact with the Romanian population. The lowlands they occupied had once been inhabited by settled local communities, and their arrival transformed the human geography of the region. After the Mongol conquest, those Romanian-Turkic contacts appear to have weakened, most likely because the nomads themselves had lost political independence and were now absorbed into the framework of the Golden Horde. To understand that contact more clearly, we need to look not at imagined straight borders, but at how space was actually used. Older scholarship often tried to draw a firm line across Moldavia and say that everything east of one river or another was under nomadic rule. Some scholars push that boundary as far west as the mountain approaches, suggesting that the nomads took their herds deep into the Carpathian zone during the summer. But the archaeological evidence tells a different story. Burials associated with Turkic nomads cluster very clearly in the southern lowlands. When they move northward into central or northern Moldavia, they do so mainly along the major rivers and their tributaries. These rivers acted as seasonal corridors. The nomads did not spread evenly across the land. They followed water and pasture. This difference matters. The nomads preferred the lowlands, the wetlands, and the valleys rich in grass. The Romanian settlements, by contrast, appear across almost the whole landscape of Moldavia, except for the highest mountaintops. The old idea that Romanians were primarily a mountain people does not fit the evidence for the lands east of the Carpathians. That image may reflect the Balkan Vlachs, or certain ancient descriptions of Dacians, but it does not describe medieval Moldavia. Archaeology shows a population living in plains, hills, valleys, and forest margins, not one confined to mountain refuge. In fact, the mountains and densely forested highlands were not ideal for steppe horsemen at all. Their way of life depended on open ground, broad pasture, and easy movement. That is why they remained mainly in the lowlands and along the great river routes. Even so, the zone of contact between the settled population and the nomads did not remain fixed over the centuries. In the earlier phase of Pecheneg presence, the number of nomads in the lower Danube region seems to have been relatively limited, and native settlements still survived in the lowlands. But as the nomadic presence grew, especially from the mid-11th century onward, local farming communities began to withdraw. Villages of the older settlement culture in the plains were abandoned. By the late 12th century, this retreat had spread into the contact zone between plain and hill country, and in some areas even deeper into the southern uplands. These changes were not caused by a total replacement of population, but by pressure. The nomads needed wider pasture lands, and their raids created insecurity. Farming families moved away from areas that had become too exposed and too unstable. One of the most revealing ways to trace these long contacts is through names in the landscape. Medieval place names, river names, and personal names preserve the memory of Turkic presence better than many written chronicles do. For a long time, however, historians approached this material too casually, often linking every suspicious-sounding name to a nomadic tribe without careful examination. That created a misleading picture. In reality, the evidence is more subtle and much more interesting. There are certainly place names in Moldavia and Wallachia that recall Turkic ethnic names, especially those connected with the Cumans and the Berendei. Names built on Coman or Berendei appear across a wide area. Rivers such as the Uz and Oitus, were once connected to the Uzes, and other names were linked to the Pechenegs or the Brodniks. But many of these associations do not hold up under closer scrutiny. Some river names, once thought to preserve tribal identities, may have nothing to do with them at all. In other cases, the connection is possible, but uncertain. The result is that the older habit of scattering Pechenegs and Uzes everywhere across the map simply because of later place names has to be treated with great caution. A better approach is to separate genuine Turkic place names from those that only look ethnic but actually derive from personal names. Some villages called Comana or Comanești, for example, do not preserve the memory of a Cuman tribe at all. They derive from men named Coman, founders or landholders, whose personal names had long since entered Romanian society. The same is true for Berinde and similar names. By the late Middle Ages and later, these were common personal names in Romanian lands. Villages were often named after such men, not after the tribes from which the names may once have originated. This is a crucial distinction. A place called Comanești does not prove that Cumans once lived there. It may simply prove that a man named Coman owned or founded the settlement centuries later. This becomes even clearer when we compare the distribution of these place names with the archaeological evidence. Many village names derived from Coman, Berinde, or similar forms appear in upland regions where no trace of nomadic burial assemblages has been found. In Moldavia, a striking number of them lie west of the Siret, precisely in areas where the archaeological record does not support a strong nomadic presence. The same mismatch appears elsewhere. Place names linked to the Pechenegs are found in parts of Ukraine and Russia where no Pecheneg settlement ever existed. That alone is enough to show that the spread of such names cannot be used as a simple map of ethnic occupation. River names are a different matter. Because the nomads moved seasonally and relied heavily on orientation through river valleys and watercourses, they were more likely to leave a lasting mark on hydronyms than on village names. In the Carpathian Dnester region, river names ending in forms such as ui or lu a cluster, especially in southern Moldavia. This is exactly the zone where burial evidence shows the greatest concentration of nomadic movement. The same pattern appears in the Romanian plain, where such names are common in the lowlands. This overlap is highly significant. Unlike villages, rivers do not move, and their names are often older than the later settlements around them. For mobile herders crossing the same valleys year after year, naming rivers would have been essential, so these hydronyms probably preserve a more authentic trace of nomadic presence than many village names do. When we bring all of this together, a clearer picture emerges. The nomads did not dominate all of Moldavia equally, nor did they flood into the mountain regions every summer. Their power was strongest in the southern lowlands, especially the Bugeac and the river corridors leading northward. They moved seasonally along the major valleys, but avoided the densely forested highlands. The settled Romanian population, by contrast, occupied a much broader range of landscapes, and withdrew gradually only as pressure from the nomads increased. Their relationship was not one of simple separation, but one of shifting overlap, especially along the frontier between open steppe and wooded upland. The evidence of names confirms this, but only when handled carefully. Later, place names built on Turkic forms do not always point to ethnic settlement. Very often they point instead to personal names that had already been absorbed into Romanian naming traditions. River names, however, are more reliable markers of seasonal mobility and long-term contact. They show that the southern lowlands and the major river valleys were the true zone of deepest interaction between Romanians and the Turkic steppe world. When we look closely at village names in Moldavia and Wallachia that seem to come from Turkic peoples, an important pattern appears. Many of these names end in forms typical of Romanian placemaking, which strongly suggests that the people who actually gave those names were Romanians, not nomadic Turks themselves. In other words, even when a village name sounds Cuman or Berendei in origin, the form it takes often shows that it passed through a Romanian-speaking environment before becoming fixed on the map. This changes the whole perspective. It means that the influence of the nomads on the local landscape was often indirect. These names were not always left behind by tribal settlement. In many cases, they were created by local communities using personal names or inherited memory. That point becomes even clearer when we examine the personal names themselves. Names such as Coman and Berendei appear regularly in Moldavian and Wallachian documents from the 14th and 15th centuries, but they do not appear there as ethnic labels. They appear as ordinary first names. Some of the men who carried them were high-ranking boyars. Others were people of humbler background, including gypsy slaves attached to monasteries. This is extremely important because it shows that by that time the names had already been absorbed into local society. A man called Coman in a Moldavian charter was not necessarily, or even usually, an ethnic Cuman. He was often simply a Romanian or another local inhabitant, bearing a name that had entered common use. The same pattern can be seen in Wallachia. There too, Coman appears in early documents as a personal name used by boyars, scribes, and local landholders. Over time, it became even more widespread, later surviving especially as a family name. The feminine form also appears, which is another sign that the name had been fully domesticated inside local naming customs. A name does not become truly local until it begins to produce derivatives, feminine forms, and family branches of its own. That happened here. The name ceased to be a marker of foreignness and became part of the normal, onomastic life of the Romanian lands. In fact, the geographical distribution of the name makes this even more revealing. In later centuries, Coman became especially common in regions like Vrancea, where a cluster of other Turkic-sounding names also appears. That regional concentration is unlikely to be accidental. It probably reflects zones where earlier contact with nomadic groups was especially strong. But again, what survived was not an ethnic enclave. It was a naming habit, a cultural memory transformed into local usage. The people carrying these names were not simply remnants of a nomadic tribe. They were members of settled communities who had inherited names through a long chain of contact, prestige, imitation, and adaptation. The same is true west of the Carpathians. In Transylvania, the name Coman was also widely used, and in some cases it clearly belonged to Romanians. Priests, kneses, serfs, and other villagers all appear in documents with this name. By the early modern period, it had become extremely common in regions with strong Romanian populations, especially in southern Transylvania. Variants and derivatives also developed. This suggests that some of the people who later carried names like Coman into Moldavia may have come from Transylvania or Maramuresh, where those names were already well established among Romanians. So the spread of the name was not simply a direct result of Cuman settlement in the east. It was also shaped by movements of Romanian populations within the wider Carpathian world. The broader Balkan picture confirms this even more strongly. Names derived from Cuman identity appear in Serbia, Dalmatia, Albania, Macedonia, the Greek world, and even on islands in the Aegean. In some places they belong to priests, peasants, merchants, or dependent villagers. In others they appear as nicknames, patronymics, or inherited family names. The crucial fact is that many of these regions never experienced large-scale, permanent, Cuman settlement. That means the names cannot be read as direct proof of ethnic presence. Instead, they reflect fame, contact, memory, and social labelling. A person called Cuman or Komanos might have had a distant ancestor of Cuman origin, or might simply have inherited a nickname that had long since lost its original ethnic meaning. This is why the history of these names must be handled carefully. At first, such a name may indeed have been a nickname given to someone of foreign background. A Cuman living among Romanians, Greeks, or Slavs could easily be called the Cuman by his neighbours. Over time, however, that label could become hereditary. Then, in a later stage, it could pass even to people with no real Cuman ancestry at all, simply because it had become a normal personal name. Once that happened, the name entered the local naming system, just like any other. The same process is known for many ethnic names in medieval and early modern Europe. Romanian naming practice offers many parallels. People were often called by names that originally referred to neighbouring peoples: Armenian, Bulgarian, Frank, Greek, Saxon, Serb, Tatar, Turk, Hungarian, and others. In most cases, these began as nicknames and later became family names. The name Coman differs only in that it became more widely used as a first name rather than remaining mainly a surname. But the logic is the same. These names do not prove direct ethnic identity. They show how deeply neighbouring peoples entered local imagination and social language. This is why it would be wrong to treat every Coman in a medieval document as a Cuman by blood. The evidence simply does not support that. Already in the earliest documents from Moldavia, Wallachia, and Transylvania, the name is functioning as a normal personal name, not as an ethnic description. The same applies to Berende. Their survival says less about isolated pockets of Turkic tribes and more about the long afterlife of Turkic influence within Romanian society. These names became part of local culture even after the nomads themselves had disappeared as an independent force. In the end, this leads to a more nuanced conclusion. The Turkic impact on Romanian vocabulary and naming was real, but often indirect. It wasn't always the result of massive settlement or direct ethnic continuity. More often, it came through prestige, contact, imitation, and the slow incorporation of foreign names into local usage. Some names may have reached Moldavia through Transylvania, where Romanian communities had already adopted them. Others may have entered through broader Balkan and Hungarian naming habits. Hungary is especially important here, because it absorbed many Turkic groups and preserved a remarkable number of Turkic-derived names, perhaps more than any neighbouring region. From there, too, influences could spread outward. In the Bulgarian lands, personal names of Turkic origin were also remarkably widespread. Early Ottoman tax records preserve hundreds of such names among the population, and this is highly revealing. Because those registers were written only a few decades after the Ottoman conquest of northeastern Bulgaria, it is difficult to explain all of these names simply as a result of later Ottoman influence. Many of them must go back to an older layer of Turkic presence in the Balkans, especially to the Pechenegs and the Cumans, though in some cases an even earlier Bulgar background may also be possible. Names such as Asen, Balaban, Barak, Dogan, Karaman, Cuman, Kuno, Kurt, Shishman, Tugrul, and many others show just how deeply older steppe traditions had entered the naming habits of the region. The most striking of all is Cuman, which appears again and again, suggesting that the memory of the Cumans remained especially strong. Even the famous name Asen has long been debated, with some seeing in it a Romanian background, others a Cuman one, and still others an older Bulgar origin. Whatever the exact answer, the broader picture is clear. Turkic names had become part of the social landscape of the Balkans long before Ottoman rule could explain them. Language, however, is harder to untangle than personal names. Over the centuries, Romanian absorbed many words from Turkic-speaking peoples, but separating the older Pecheneg and Cuman layers, from later Tatar or Ottoman Turkish influence is extremely difficult. The problem is simple. We know too little about what Romanian looked like between the 9th and 13th centuries, and the Pecheneg language has not survived in any full form. Even when a Romanian word resembles one preserved in Cuman materials, that resemblance alone does not prove direct borrowing from the Cumans. So while the influence is real, its chronology is often uncertain. What matters more is the larger reality behind it. Romanians and Turkic nomads lived in contact for centuries, and that contact inevitably left marks in vocabulary, especially in fields connected with horsemanship, herding, and warfare. That contact was not just linguistic, it was rooted in the most practical struggles of daily life. For the nomads, pasture and water were essential. Their westward movement into the lands north of the Danube and Black Sea was driven above all by the search for grazing grounds. This is what pushed them into regions already occupied by settled agricultural communities in the Bujiak and the Baragan. The displacement of those farming populations did not happen all at once, but over a long period. Seasonal nomadic migrations must have disturbed local agricultural life again and again. Even when the nomads did not occupy an area in overwhelming numbers, their repeated movements and raids disrupted the rhythms of planting, harvesting, herding, and trade. For the local communities, life in the lowlands became increasingly insecure. Older historians often describe the nomads as a kind of half-parasitic society that could survive only by feeding off settled populations. But that view is too simple. Contemporary sources make it clear that the nomads produced much of their own food through herding. They were not dependent on peasants for daily survival. They could live for long periods far away from farming communities. Raids were not a substitute for subsistence. They were a way of securing extra wealth, goods, captives, and prestige. Tribute, too, played a role. The nomads often imposed payments on weaker settled groups, and violence was one of the tools they used to make that system work. Yet even here, the relationship was not one of total economic dependence. The nomads did not need peasant food in order to exist. What they wanted from the settled world was surplus. Archaeology helps reveal how this process unfolded on the ground. On a number of sites in southern Moldavia and eastern Wallachia, settlements associated with local village cultures have been found in the same places as later nomadic burials. In a few cases, the sequence is clear. The settlement came first, the burial later. In most cases, however, the exact overlap is harder to prove. Still, the general pattern strongly suggests that many burials of nomadic warriors post-date the local settlements. That means the nomads entered landscapes that had already been occupied and cultivated. They did not move into an empty steppe. They took control of regions where local people had already lived. The most serious consequence of this presence was political. The nomads had a deeply negative effect on the development of local society, especially by delaying the formation of stable political structures. Wherever settled communities began to strengthen, they faced the military superiority of mounted steppe warriors. If this was already a major problem in regions like Transylvania, where leaders had to face both Hungarian expansion and nomadic pressure, then the effect must have been even harsher east of the Carpathians, where the lowlands lay open to mounted raiders. There is no evidence that the local population was able to organise a sustained military resistance in these centuries. Whatever armed force they could muster was no match for experienced steppe horsemen who were already capable of devastating Hungary, Rus', Byzantium, and Bulgaria. The settlement map reflects this reality with brutal clarity. In the 9th to 11th centuries, many villages lay in the lowlands and hills outside the Carpathians. But by the late 14th and early 15th centuries, the pattern had changed completely. In the southern plains, especially in the Bujiak, the Balci Plain, and other exposed regions, the number of villages had collapsed. In contrast, settlement became denser in safer areas between the Prut and the Carpathians. This pattern remained broadly stable for centuries afterward. The difference between the earlier and later maps points to a massive demographic retreat from the open lowlands, a retreat that probably reached its lowest point in the 12th and 13th centuries. The regions most affected were exactly those without forest cover, exactly those with the best grazing lands, and exactly those most attractive to nomadic herders. This retreat had major economic consequences. Local communities forced into hills and forest margins had to survive in environments less suitable for intensive agriculture. Their access to the richest lowland soils was lost. Traditional routes of transhumance were disrupted because winter grazing zones near the Danube and the Black Sea had fallen under nomadic control. Trade and cultural ties with Byzantium were weakened as well. Altogether, the pressure of the nomads contributed to stagnation, to a delay in social stratification, and probably to the postponement of stronger political institutions. Any emerging local power could easily be seen by the nomads as a threat, and crushed before it matured. The impact of the nomads was strongest in southern Moldavia and in the river valleys leading northward. These corridors gave them access to the eastern half of the wider Carpathian Dniester region. But there was one zone they did not truly dominate, the densely forested hills and mountain areas of northern and western Moldavia. Those regions provided natural cover and relative security. Like the Alps, the Pyrenees, the Balkans, or the Caucasus in other parts of Europe, the Carpathians offered a form of refuge. They were not ideal for steppe horsemen, but they could shelter the local population from extermination or complete assimilation. In the plains, by contrast, communities were far more vulnerable. Peoples who lived only in the open lowlands, whether ancient or medieval, were always at risk from stronger neighbours. This contrast may even have left traces in language. The Romanian spoken in northern and central Moldavia shows stronger ties to Transylvanian speech, while the subdialect of southern Moldavia is closer to Wallachia. That difference may reflect the demographic upheavals caused by nomadic movement and the long-term reshaping of the human map. Some historians once argued that the nomads may actually have helped the emergence of local elites and early states, rather than simply hindering them. That idea was influenced by examples from the Balkans, where Cumans played a visible role in the rise of the Second Bulgarian Empire, and later became closely linked with ruling dynasties. Similar arguments were made for Wallachia, especially because the name Basarab appears to be of Turkic origin. From this, some concluded that the first Wallachian dynasty must have been Cuman. But names alone cannot bear that weight. Just as the earliest Hungarian leaders had Turkic names without ceasing to be the founders of a Hungarian polity, so too a ruler named Basarab need not have been ethnically Cuman in any simple sense. By his time, the Turkic groups north of the Danube had already lost their political independence under Mongol rule. Even if some distant ancestor of Basarab had a Turkic background, Basarab himself belonged to the Romanian political world. In fact, the evidence for a strong Turkic contribution to the ruling class of Moldavia, or Wallachia, is very thin. Boyars with names of Turkic origin do appear, but only occasionally, and such names are also found far below the elite, even among slaves. That makes it difficult to argue that Turkic elements shaped the rise of the Romanian states in any major way. In places like Rus, Bulgaria, Hungary, and Georgia, dynastic marriages and direct alliances with Cuman elites were common and politically useful. In those lands, Cumans could become integrated into aristocratic power. But the Romanian lands east of the Carpathians present a different picture. Before the Mongol invasion, no strong Romanian polity existed that could form equal alliances with nomadic powers. After the Mongol conquest, the Turkic groups themselves were politically subordinate. Under such conditions, large-scale political cooperation would have brought little advantage to either side. That does not mean the relationship was only violent. Trade and peaceful exchange certainly existed. If both Romanians and Nomads traded with neighbouring states, it is natural that they traded with each other as well. Still, the archaeological evidence for this is surprisingly limited. Very few objects clearly made by Nomads have been found on local Romanian settlement sites, and those that do appear are isolated pieces such as horse gear or pendants. This is enough to prove contact, but not enough to suggest deep or permanent economic integration. The rarity of such finds fits what we would expect in a frontier zone where raids and tribute extraction often overshadowed peaceful exchange. There is also a persistent assumption in some historiography that sedentary societies were automatically more advanced than nomadic ones. That may make some sense when comparing Byzantium or Kievan Ruses with the steppe. But the Romanian communities east of the Carpathians were not Byzantium. They were rural, politically fragmented, and themselves underdeveloped in many ways because of constant pressure. On the other hand, the nomadic groups west of the Dnieper were not always as rich or as culturally developed as their counterparts farther east. Their archaeological record shows fewer gold and silver items, fewer monumental markers, and less artistic richness. So, neither side in this frontier can be reduced to a simple opposition between civilized and primitive. Both were limited in different ways, and both were shaped by the difficult environment in which they met. One more question remains. Did any of the nomads settle down and merge into the local Romanian population? In principle, yes, but probably only on a small scale. Nomads did not abandon their way of life willingly. Again and again in Eurasian history, forced settlement happened only under powerful external pressure. As long as a tribe still had pasture and political autonomy, it had no reason to become sedentary. This is true for Pechenegs, who entered Byzantium, and for Cumans, who fled to Hungary. Even when they converted to Christianity, they resisted giving up nomadism unless completely cut off from the steppe. North of the lower Danube, no political force before the 13th century was strong enough to force such a transformation. Only with Hungarian intervention in the region and the disintegration of Cuman power did the conditions for settlement begin to appear. Some Cumans, connected with the bishopric, created for them under Hungarian influence, may indeed have expressed a wish to build towns and villages. Yet even that process remained incomplete, and the Mongol invasion soon interrupted it. After the Golden Horde took control, free movement out of the steppe became difficult, and large refugee movements were no longer easily tolerated. Under those circumstances, only small groups or isolated families seem to have entered local Romanian society and gradually assimilated. This is why, despite more than 400 years of coexistence in the same broad region, there was no deep and lasting symbiosis between Romanians and Turkic nomads in the lands outside the Carpathians. The two societies were too different in religion, economy, social structure, and daily way of life. They lived near one another, but did not truly merge in any large-scale way. The nomads certainly had a negative impact on Romanian development, but they did not fundamentally reshape Romanian society from within. Their strongest influence came in more practical fields: horsemanship, pastoral habits, and especially warfare, where light cavalry tactics left a mark. Even there, the later Mongol presence probably reinforced what earlier Turkic groups had begun. The nomads, for their part, were mostly content to plunder, exact tribute, and leave local structures intact as long as dues continued to flow. They did not try to remake Romanian society in their own image. nor did they seem deeply interested in altering the religion or internal social organisation of the communities under their control. In return, they may sometimes have offered a measure of military protection, but only within the logic of domination. Romanian influence on the nomads was even more limited. Nomadic conservatism, combined with the fact that each successive group was eventually displaced by stronger newcomers, meant that little time existed for deep integration. To the local population, the Pechenegs, Uzis, and Cumans must often have seemed like variations of the same steppe world, all sharing the same mobile way of life. In the end, the real symbiosis between nomads and settled peoples tended to happen not in the lands outside the Carpathians, but in places like the Balkans or the Pannonian Plain, where defeated nomadic groups could settle more permanently and be absorbed. North of the lower Danube, by contrast, the steppe was too unstable. One horde replaced another, the lowlands were abandoned again and again, and the local population lived in constant uncertainty. Such conditions did not favour deep fusion. They favoured survival, retreat, and endurance.